Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to give a thank you to Don Welsh for this incredible video suggestion. The Tetris conspiracy is one of those rabbit holes that just keeps getting deeper the more you dig. If you have ideas for future videos, please drop them in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoy these deep dives into the mysteries that keep us awake at night, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Sleep Theories. Trust me, after tonight's story you might need something to help you sleep. Now, let me tell you about the package that changed everything, and how a simple children's game became the key to understanding one of the Cold War's most carefully buried secrets. I never thought I'd be pulled into a Cold War ghost story. My life was ordinary. A freelance researcher with a small apartment, a dying houseplant, and a Netflix subscription that got more use than my gym membership. I wrote articles about obscure historical events for online magazines that paid just enough to keep the lights on. Nothing exciting, nothing dangerous. But then the package arrived. It came on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier service I'd never heard of, Meridian Express. The driver was nervous, constantly checking his phone, and he made me sign 3 different forms before he'd hand over the manila envelope. No return address, just my name written in careful block letters across the front, Elena Vasquez, personal and confidential. Inside I found documents that shouldn't have existed. Soviet-era memos with Cyrillic letterheads, computer printouts from the 1980s, and scientific papers that looked like they'd been smuggled out of some classified archive. But it was the photograph that made my hand shake. A Polaroid, faded and slightly yellow around the edges. The image showed a group of men in thick sweaters standing around what looked like an early computer terminal. The setting was clearly academic. I could see chalkboards covered in equations in the background. But there, in the corner of the photo, was a little girl with pigtails playing with building blocks on the floor. The little girl was me, and the man kneeling beside me, showing me how to stack the coloured blocks, was someone I'd never seen before in my life. According to the handwritten note on the back of the photo, Vladimir Pokilko, Moscow Computer Center, 1987. The note at the bottom of the package explained everything and nothing at once. Eleanor, your father's work touched more lives than he ever knew. What happened to us was not an accident. The game was never just a game. You have his eyes, and more importantly, you have his mind. Be careful who you trust. The blocks are still falling. A friend. I sat in my kitchen for 20 minutes staring at that photograph. My father, Dr. Miguel Vasquez, had been a computer scientist who'd worked on early artificial intelligence research in the late 1980s. He'd died when I was 12, a heart attack, sudden and unexpected. But I remembered him telling me stories about his work, about trips to conferences where brilliant minds from around the world shared their discoveries. One story in particular came flooding back. He'd told me about a simple game that had captured the imagination of everyone who played it. 7 shapes, falling from the sky, fitting together like pieces of an impossible puzzle. The most beautiful thing about mathematics, he'd said, is that even chaos follows patterns. That game proves it. He'd been talking about Tetris. I'd never connected those childhood stories to the global phenomenon Tetris became. But as I looked at that photograph, as I saw myself playing with blocks while Vladimir Pokilko watched, I realised I hadn't stumbled into this mystery. I'd been born into it. The package wasn't a random delivery, it was an inheritance. And according to what I was about to discover, it was also a death sentence. The first thing I learned about Tetris was that everything I thought I knew was wrong. Most people believe the story goes like this. In 1984, a Russian programmer named Alexei Pajitnov created a simple puzzle game while working at the Moscow Academy of Sciences. The game was so addictive that it spread through the Soviet Union like wildfire, eventually making its way to the West, where it became one of the most successful video games of all time. A beautiful story of creativity triumphing over Cold War tensions, but my father's notebooks told a different story. I found them 3 days after receiving the package, hidden in a storage unit I'd inherited but never bothered to visit. Box after box of research papers, computer printouts, and handwritten journals that my father had apparently been keeping secret for years. The notebooks were written in a mixture of English and Spanish, with mathematical formulas scattered throughout like some kind of academic code. The entry that changed everything was dated October 15th, 1987. The Moscow conference was more productive than expected. Met with Pokhilko's team today. Their work on pattern recognition is fascinating but disturbing. The game they've developed, they call it Tetris from the Greek tetra meaning four, shows remarkable potential for cognitive conditioning. The subjects who play for extended periods exhibit measurable changes in brainwave patterns. Pokhilko believes they've accidentally created a form of technological hypnosis. The entry continued. Showed Elena the coloured blocks today while we were in Moscow. She was so young, so innocent. She didn't understand that she was playing with the building blocks of something that could reshape human consciousness. None of us did. We thought we were just studying games. We had no idea we were creating weapons. I read that passage 5 times before it sank in. My father hadn't just been a conference attendee in Moscow. He'd been part of the team that helped develop Tetris, and according to his notes, they'd discovered something that terrified them. The game was changing people's minds. The phenomenon was subtle at first. Players would report seeing the falling blocks when they closed their eyes. They'd dream about the game. They'd find themselves mentally rotating objects in daily life, trying to make them fit together like Tetris pieces. Researchers dubbed it the Tetris effect, and initially everyone thought it was harmless, just the brain's way of processing repetitive visual information. But my father's notes suggested something much more sinister. The Tetris effect wasn't just visual persistence, it was cognitive rewiring. Players were being conditioned to think in patterns, to seek order from chaos, to derive satisfaction from solving problems that had been specifically designed to trigger dopamine release. In other words, Tetris was a mind control experiment disguised as entertainment. My father's final entry about the Moscow project was dated November the 3rd, 1987. Had to leave the conference early. Pokhilko pulled me aside yesterday, said things were getting dangerous. The KGB has taken interest in our research. They don't see Tetris as a game. They see it as a tool for psychological manipulation. Military applications, civilian control. I'm bringing Elena home tomorrow. Some discoveries are too dangerous to pursue. That was the last mention of Tetris in my father's notebooks for over a decade, but I knew the story didn't end there. Because if it had, I never would have received that package. Someone wanted me to know what really happened to Tetris. More importantly, they wanted me to understand what had happened to the people who'd helped create it. And as I was about to discover, very few of those people were still alive. Robert Maxwell died on November 5th, 1991, but the circumstances of his death were so bizarre that conspiracy theorists are still debating them today. The media mogul and publisher was found floating in the Atlantic Ocean near the Canary Islands, having apparently fallen overboard from his luxury yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. Some called it suicide, others suspected murder. But almost nobody connected his death to a simple puzzle game. Almost nobody. Among my father's papers, I found a folder labelled Maxwell Correspondence 1990 to 1991. Inside were photocopies of letters that revealed a side of Robert Maxwell's business empire that had never made it into the history books. Maxwell hadn't just been interested in newspapers and publishing. He'd been deeply involved in the international licensing of Soviet software, including games. The letter that caught my attention was dated March 18th, 1991. Dear Doctor, Vasquez, I hope this letter finds you well. As discussed during our meeting in London, I remain very interested in the psychological applications you and your Moscow colleagues discovered. The commercial success of the game has exceeded all projections, but I believe we've only scratched the surface of its potential. The pharmaceutical applications alone could be worth billions. Please reconsider your decision to withdraw from the project. Some opportunities only come once in a lifetime. R. Maxwell. Pharmaceutical applications? I read the letter 3 times, trying to understand what Maxwell could have meant. Then I found my father's reply, dated March 25th, 1991. Robert, I've made my position clear. The research we conducted in Moscow was preliminary and potentially dangerous. The cognitive effects we observed in test subjects were concerning enough to warrant ceasing all experiments. I will not be party to any attempt to weaponize this technology, regardless of the financial incentives involved. Please do not contact me about this matter again. Miguel Vasquez. But Maxwell did contact him again. The folder contained 7 more letters, each one increasingly desperate, increasingly threatening. Maxwell's final letter, dated October the 30th, 1991, just 6 days before his death, was the most chilling. Miguel, you're making a mistake that will cost both of us dearly. The people I represent are not patient. They invested heavily in this project based on the promise of the Moscow research. If you continue to refuse cooperation, I cannot guarantee your safety or that of your family. This is not a threat. It's a warning. There are forces at work here that neither of us fully understands. R.M. 6 days later, Robert Maxwell was dead. The official investigation concluded that Maxwell had either committed suicide or suffered an accidental fall from his yacht. But investigators found several unusual details that never made it into the public record. Maxwell's personal safe had been emptied before his death, and several £1 million had been transferred from his accounts to shell companies in Eastern Europe. More importantly, his yacht's security cameras had been mysteriously disabled during the exact time frame of his disappearance. I might have dismissed these coincidences if I hadn't found one more document in my father's files. A newspaper clipping from the London Times, dated November the 7th, 1991. Someone had highlighted a single paragraph buried deep in the article about Maxwell's death. Among Maxwell's personal effects recovered from the yacht were several computer disks labelled Project Tetris, and a notebook containing what appeared to be psychological research notes. These items have been turned over to British intelligence for investigation. Project Tetris. My father had never mentioned any project by that name, but the connection was obvious. Maxwell had been trying to commercialise the psychological effects that the Moscow team had discovered. He'd been working with people who had enough power and influence to make problems disappear permanently. And when Maxwell tried to back out, or perhaps demanded too much money, those same people had made him disappear too. The question that kept me awake at night was simple. If they were willing to kill Robert Maxwell, one of the most powerful media moguls in the world, what would they do to the researchers who'd actually created the technology? I was about to find out. Vladimir Pokhilko was supposed to be a success story. The co-creator of Tetris had emigrated to the United States in the 1990s and founded his own software company in Silicon Valley. He had the American dream within his grasp. A beautiful house in Palo Alto, a loving wife, 2 children, and the promise of financial success from his work on one of the world's most popular games. On September 22nd, 1998, police found Vladimir Pokhilko, his wife Elena, and their 12-year-old son Peter dead in their home. The official report concluded that Pokhilko had murdered his family before taking his own life, driven to madness by financial pressures and the stress of a failing business. But the evidence never quite added up. Among the documents in the package I'd received was a police report that had supposedly been sealed. The details painted a picture that was much more complex and disturbing than the official story suggested. Pokhilko had been found with multiple stab wounds, which was unusual for a suicide. His wife and son showed signs of struggle, but there was no evidence that Pokhilko had been physically capable of overpowering both of them. Most importantly, neighbours reported seeing unfamiliar cars in the area during the days leading up to the deaths. But it was the contents of Pokhilko's home office that revealed the truth. According to the police inventory, investigators found dozens of pages of handwritten notes in Russian, all apparently burned in the fireplace except for fragments that had escaped the flames. The few readable pieces contained references to psychological experiments, Moscow protocols, and behavioural modification through repetitive stimulus. One fragment preserved in the police file was particularly chilling. The game was never the goal. The game was the delivery mechanism. We created the perfect Trojan horse, entertainment that reprograms the mind through voluntary participation. But they want to weaponize it, to use it for purposes we never intended. I've tried to stop them, but... The note ended there, torn and partially burned. The package I'd received contained something the police had never seen. a recording of Vladimir Pokhilko's last phone call, made just hours before his death. The audio quality was poor, full of static and background noise, but Pokhilko's voice was unmistakable. He was speaking to someone who wasn't responding, perhaps leaving a voicemail message. If you're listening to this, it means they found me. I've tried to warn everyone who was part of the original research, but most of them are already gone. Maxwell was just the beginning. They're systematically eliminating everyone who knows the truth about what we created. Static filled the recording for several seconds before Pokhilko's voice returned, more urgent now. The game is still active, still spreading, still changing minds on a global scale. But that was never the plan. We thought we were creating entertainment. We didn't know we were creating a weapon, and now that weapon is being used against millions of people without their knowledge or consent. Another pause, then Pokhilko's voice became almost whispered. Miguel Vasquez was smart to leave when he did. He saw where this was heading before the rest of us. If they come for me, tell him. Tell him the devil is in the code. The patterns aren't random. They never were. Each level, each piece placement, each reward mechanism, it's all designed to create specific neurological responses. We built a machine that learns how to manipulate human behaviour, and now we've lost control of it. The recording ended abruptly, cut off mid-sentence. I listened to that message 12 times, and each time I felt a chill run down my spine. Vladimir Pokhilko hadn't killed his family and himself. He'd been silenced because he was trying to expose the truth about Tetris. And in his final moments, he'd specifically mentioned my father's name. My father had known this was coming. That's why he'd left the Moscow project. That's why he'd hidden his research. And that's why he'd never told me the truth about what he'd been involved in. But someone had decided it was time for me to know. The question was, who had sent me the package and why were they willing to risk their life to get this information to me? The human brain is remarkably adaptable. Give it a repetitive task and it will quickly develop neural pathways to handle that task more efficiently. Show it patterns and it will learn to recognize and predict those patterns. This neuroplasticity is usually considered a good thing. It's how we learn languages, develop skills, and adapt to new environments. But my father's research had discovered that this adaptability could be exploited. The notebook I'd found contained detailed studies of Tetris players, conducted over several months in 1987. The results were both fascinating and terrifying. After just 2 weeks of regular play, subjects showed measurable changes in brainwave patterns. After a month, they exhibited altered sleep cycles, with REM sleep dominated by geometric patterns and spatial processing dreams. After 3 months, the changes became permanent. Most concerning was what my father called the compliance correlation. Players who spent more than an hour per day playing Tetris showed increased susceptibility to authority figures and decreased critical thinking when faced with routine tasks. They became, in his words, more comfortable with imposed order and less likely to question systematic control. The implications were staggering. Tetris wasn't just addictive in the conventional sense. It was literally rewiring players' brains to be more compliant, more accepting of external control, more willing to find satisfaction in repetitive, meaningless tasks. It was the perfect tool for social conditioning. My father's notes from October 1987 revealed the moment when he realised what they had created. Observed Eleanor playing with the coloured blocks again today. She's become obsessed with making them fit together perfectly, just like the Tetris players in our study. But when I tried to get her to stop and help with dinner, she became agitated and insisted on finishing the pattern. This is exactly the behaviour we've documented in the test subjects, an inability to abandon incomplete geometric tasks, even when more important activities require attention. The realisation hit me like a physical blow. We haven't just created a game that changes how people think. We've created a game that makes people prioritise the game over everything else in their lives, and if that principle could be applied to other activities, other systems, other forms of control... I need to get Elena away from Moscow immediately. This research needs to be buried. But the research hadn't been buried. According to the documents in the package, it had been expanded. I found copies of scientific papers published in obscure Soviet journals throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. The authors were always different, But the research methodology was identical to what my father had documented. Studies on geometric pattern recognition and behavioural modification, experiments in visual stimulus conditioning and compliance enhancement, theoretical frameworks for large-scale cognitive influence through interactive media. The most chilling paper was published in 1992, 3 years after my father had left the project. The title was innocuous: Applications of Repetitive Visual Stimulus in Educational Software Design. But the content described a systematic program to embed Tetris-like elements into everything from children's learning games to employee training programs. The authors had figured out how to weaponize the Tetris effect, and they were deploying it everywhere. I started paying attention to the games my friends played, the apps on their phones, the casual entertainment they consumed during breaks at work. The patterns were everywhere once I knew how to look for them. Falling objects that needed to be arranged, repetitive tasks that provided small rewards at regular intervals, visual stimuli designed to trigger the same neurological responses that my father's team had first documented in Moscow. We weren't just playing games, we were being programmed. The most disturbing part was how voluntary it all seemed. Nobody was forcing people to play these games. In fact, people paid money for the privilege of having their minds reshaped. They carried the programming devices in their pockets, installed the conditioning software on their home computers, and spent hours each day voluntarily submitting to psychological manipulation. And they enjoyed it. My father had tried to stop this from happening, but he'd been just one researcher against a system that had recognised the incredible potential of what they'd discovered. The people behind Project Tetris hadn't just created a game, they'd created a blueprint for controlling human behaviour on a global scale. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If the technology was so powerful and so widespread, why were the original researchers being killed? Why not just buy their silence with money and success? The answer, I realised, was simple. The researchers knew too much about how the system worked, and more importantly, they knew how to turn it off. Death has a way of following certain kinds of knowledge. The deeper I dug into the history of Tetris and its creators, the more bodies I found scattered across 3 decades. It started with the obvious cases, Robert Maxwell and Vladimir Pokilko, but the pattern extended far beyond the famous names. Dr. Alexei Gerasimov, one of the original Moscow researchers, died in a car accident in 1994. Professor Marina Volkov, who had studied the psychological effects of geometric puzzles, succumbed to a sudden illness in 1996. Viktor Briabrin, who helped program the first version of Tetris, was found dead in his apartment from an apparent gas leak in 2001. Each death had a plausible explanation. Car accidents happen, people get sick, gas leaks occur. But when I mapped out the timeline and cross-referenced it with the documents in the package, a clear pattern emerged. Everyone who had intimate knowledge of the psychological research behind Tetris was dying at a rate that defied statistical probability. The folder labelled Casualty Report contained obituaries, newspaper clippings and death certificates for 47 individuals connected to the original Moscow project or its subsequent developments. 47 people, dead over the course of 20 years, with an average age of death significantly lower than the general population. But it was the method of elimination that revealed the true sophistication of whoever was behind this. No obvious assassinations, no suspicious murders that would attract media attention. Just a steady stream of accidents, illnesses and suicides that could be explained away individually but formed an unmistakable pattern when viewed collectively. My father had been scheduled to die in 1999, according to a handwritten list I found tucked into one of the folders. His name was crossed out with a note: Natural causes, heart attack 1991. No further action required. He'd escaped the systematic elimination by dying of natural causes before they could get to him. The irony was bitter. My father's weak heart had probably saved his life by ending it, before his knowledge became too dangerous to ignore. But I was still alive, and according to the documents, I'd inherited not just my father's research, but also his place on their list. The package had been sent to me by someone who signed themselves only as Deep Throat, an obvious reference to the Watergate informant. But their identity wasn't as important as their warning. Elena, By now you understand what your father was involved in. What you may not realise is that the project never ended. Tetris was just the beginning. The technology has evolved, been refined and deployed on a scale your father never could have imagined. Every social media app, every casual game, every productivity program contains elements of the original Moscow research. Humanity is being systematically conditioned for compliance, and most people don't even realise it's happening. The original researchers are being eliminated not because they might expose the project, but because they know how to reverse its effects. Your father's notebooks contain algorithms that could potentially deprogram the conditioning, but only if someone with the right knowledge could implement them. That's why they want you dead. Not for what you know, but for what you might be able to do with what you know. You have a choice to make. You can destroy the research, disappear, and hope they leave you alone. Or you can finish what your father started and try to give humanity back its free will. But understand this. Once you make that choice, there's no going back. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth rather than risk losing control of the system they've spent decades building. The letter ended with coordinates, a location in the Nevada desert where, supposedly, I could find additional research materials that my father had hidden before his death. But first, I needed to understand something that had been nagging at me since I'd started this investigation. If the original Tetris researchers were so dangerous, why was Alexei Pajitnov, the game's creator, still alive and successful? He was living openly in the United States, had been for years, and had even worked for major companies like Microsoft. How had he escaped the fate that had claimed so many others? Alexei Pajitnov was not hard to find. Unlike the other Tetris researchers who had died mysterious deaths or disappeared entirely, the game's creator maintained a public profile. He gave interviews, attended gaming conventions, and had even been inducted into various halls of fame for his contribution to the video game industry. Getting him to talk about the Moscow research, however, proved nearly impossible. I started with emails identifying myself as the daughter of Dr. Miguel Vasquez and explaining that I was researching the early history of Tetris for an academic paper. Pajitnov's responses were polite but evasive. He claimed to remember very little about the psychological studies that had accompanied the game's development, suggesting that such research had been peripheral to the main project. When I pressed him for details about my father's involvement, Pajitnov's tone changed dramatically. Miss Vasquez, I understand your desire to learn about your father's work, but I must advise you that some historical inquiries are best left unexplored. Your father was a brilliant man who made difficult choices for the safety of his family. I suggest you honour his memory by respecting those choices. It was a warning disguised as advice, but I wasn't ready to give up. I decided to try a different approach. I called Pajitnov's office directly, identifying myself as a documentary filmmaker, interested in creating a film about the human stories behind famous games. His assistant scheduled a phone interview for the following week. When I finally got Pajitnov on the phone, I started with innocent questions about the creative process, the technical challenges of early game development, the excitement of seeing his creation become globally popular. He was engaging and enthusiastic, clearly comfortable discussing these aspects of Tetris history. Then I mentioned my father's name. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Pajitnov finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Miguel Vasquez, I haven't heard that name in... How did you say you were connected to him? He was my father. He died when I was 12, but I've been going through his research notes and found extensive documentation of the Moscow project, including his work with you on the psychological effects of geometric pattern games. Another long pause. Then, your father was a good man, a careful man. He understood the implications of our research better than most of us did. What implications? What exactly did you discover? Miss Vasquez, I think perhaps we should not continue this conversation over the telephone. If you are truly interested in understanding your father's work, you should know that there are people who would prefer that such understanding remain limited. I pushed harder. People like the ones who killed Vladimir Pokilko, the ones who eliminated Robert Maxwell. The line went dead. I tried calling back immediately, but Pajitnov's office said he was no longer available. and would not be scheduling any further interviews. My emails went unanswered. Within 48 hours, it was as if Alexei Pajitnov had completely disappeared from public life. But 3 days later, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message. Your father saved my life by warning me to cooperate. I chose survival over resistance, and that choice has haunted me for 30 years. I cannot undo what we created, but I can give you the tools your father developed to fight it. The coordinates your mystery correspondent provided are real. Go to Nevada, find the bunker, but understand that once you open that door, they will know you are no longer just investigating. You are actively opposing them. Choose carefully. AP. Beneath the message was a hand-drawn map showing a location in the Nevada desert, along with what appeared to be a complex mathematical equation. I stared at that map for hours, knowing that following it would probably be the last free choice I'd ever make. Because once I crossed that line from researcher to active resistance, I would become a target that they couldn't ignore. But I also knew that I'd already crossed the point of no return the moment I opened that first package. They were already watching me, already planning my elimination. The only question was whether I would go quietly, like most of the other researchers, or whether I would try to finish what my father had started. The answer was obvious. I booked a flight to Las Vegas and rented a car with 4-wheel drive. It was time to find my father's final gift to humanity. The Nevada desert is a perfect place to hide secrets. Miles of empty wasteland, scorching heat during the day, freezing cold at night, and enough radiation from decades of nuclear testing to make even experienced explorers think twice about venturing off the main roads. I found the location from Pajitnov's map after 6 hours of driving through increasingly desolate terrain. The coordinates led to what looked like an abandoned mining operation, a few rusted metal buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, with warning signs about unstable ground and toxic materials. But the mathematical equation Pajitnov had included wasn't random decoration. When I plugged the numbers into the GPS coordinates, they pointed to a spot about half a mile from the visible buildings, in an area that looked completely empty from the surface. I parked my rental car and walked out into the desert, following the GPS coordinates on my phone. The spot looked like every other patch of sand and scrub brush, but when I started clearing away the surface debris, I found a metal hatch buried about 2 feet underground. The hatch was locked with a combination lock, but the numbers from Pajitnov's equation opened it easily. Inside, a ladder descended into darkness. The bunker below was much larger than I'd expected. My father had apparently spent considerable time and money creating an underground research facility that could operate independently for months. Solar panels on the surface provided power. A water filtration system ensured a clean supply. And most importantly, the space was completely isolated from any electronic surveillance or communication networks. It was the perfect place to work on something that you didn't want the rest of the world to know about. My father's final research filled dozens of filing cabinets. The documents revealed the full scope of what he'd been working on during the years after he left Moscow. He hadn't abandoned the Tetris research. He'd been developing countermeasures. The folders were labelled with titles like cognitive deprogramming protocols, neural pattern disruption algorithms, and therapeutic applications of anti-Tetris technology. My father had spent over a decade figuring out how to reverse the psychological conditioning that Tetris and its derivatives had created. But more than that, he'd developed a way to immunize people against future conditioning attempts. The centerpiece of his research was something he called the Liberation Protocol, a software program that could identify and neutralize the behavioral modification elements embedded in games, apps, and other interactive media. The protocol worked by teaching the brain to recognize artificial pattern manipulation and respond with conscious resistance instead of unconscious compliance. In simple terms, my father had created a vaccine against mind control. The bad news was that the Liberation Protocol required massive computing power and global distribution to be effective. It would need to be embedded in popular software or transmitted through major communication networks to reach enough people to make a difference. And anyone attempting to deploy it would immediately become a target for elimination. As I read through the research, I began to understand why my father had hidden it instead of trying to implement it himself. The protocol was too dangerous to use and too important to destroy, but someone had decided it was time to bring it out of hiding. I was so absorbed in the documents that I almost missed the sound of vehicles approaching on the surface. By the time I realised what was happening, it was too late to escape. The voices above were professional, coordinated. I heard at least 4 different people positioning themselves around the bunker entrance. Then a voice called down through the open hatch. "Miss Vasquez, we know you're down there. Please come up slowly with your hands visible. We have some things to discuss." I looked around the bunker, searching for another exit, but my father had designed it with only one way in or out. I was trapped. But as I gathered up the most important documents and prepared to face whatever was waiting for me on the surface, I realised something that gave me hope. They hadn't killed me on sight. That meant they needed something from me. And as long as they needed me alive, I had leverage. The question was, would I be smart enough to use it? The men waiting for me on the surface were not what I'd expected. No black suits, no obvious weapons, no intimidating vehicles. Just 4 people in casual outdoor gear standing next to a couple of dusty SUVs that could have belonged to any group of desert hikers. The woman who had called down to me was perhaps 50 years old, with greying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested she'd spent considerable time in harsh environments. She smiled as I climbed out of the bunker, but it was the smile of someone who held all the cards. "Dr. Elena Vasquez, I presume. I'm Director Catherine Blackwood, and these are my colleagues. We've been looking forward to meeting you for quite some time. Let me guess, you're here to eliminate me like you did Vladimir Pokhilko and the others." Blackwood shook her head. "Actually, we're here to offer you a job." That was not what I'd been expecting. I stood there in the Nevada sand, holding a folder full of my father's research, trying to process what she'd just said. A job? Your father was brilliant, but he was also stubborn. He refused to see the bigger picture of what we were trying to accomplish. We're hoping you'll be more pragmatic. Blackwood gestured toward the SUVs. "Why don't we get out of the sun while we talk? I think once you understand what's really happening, you'll realise we're on the same side." I didn't have much choice. I climbed into the air-conditioned vehicle, and Blackwood began explaining something that was even more disturbing than anything I'd discovered in my father's files. The Tetris project hadn't been a Soviet mind control experiment. It had been a joint operation between intelligence agencies from multiple countries, designed to study and eventually control the psychological effects of mass media and interactive entertainment. The Cold War was just theatre, Blackwood continued as we drove away from the bunker. The real cooperation was happening behind the scenes, between scientists and intelligence agencies who understood that the future of human control wouldn't be through military force or political oppression. It would be through voluntary psychological conditioning. She opened a tablet and showed me documents that made my father's research look primitive by comparison. Charts tracking the behavioural patterns of millions of people. Algorithms that could predict and influence individual decision-making with frightening accuracy. Maps showing the global deployment of conditioning technology through everything from social media platforms to educational software. Tetris was our proof of concept. We proved that people would voluntarily participate in their own psychological conditioning if the experience was packaged as entertainment. But that was just the beginning. We've now embedded these principles into every aspect of digital life. I stared at the data flowing across her screen. You're talking about billions of people. Exactly. And it's working beautifully. Crime rates are down, political extremism is manageable, social unrest is rare. People are more compliant, more productive, more satisfied with routine existence. We've created a more peaceful world. By turning people into programmable robots. Blackwood's expression hardened slightly. By giving people what they actually want: order, purpose, predictability. Most humans don't want the burden of complete free will, Elena. They want to be told what to do, how to think, what to value. We've simply made that process more efficient and more humane. The SUV pulled up to a small airfield where a private jet was waiting. Blackwood continued her recruitment pitch as we walked toward the plane. Your father developed countermeasures to our conditioning protocols, but he never understood that those countermeasures would cause more harm than good. Imagine if we suddenly removed all the psychological frameworks that keep society stable. Imagine billions of people suddenly experiencing complete cognitive freedom after decades of guided thinking. The chaos would be unprecedented. She was right, and I knew it. My father's liberation protocol wouldn't just free people from conditioning, it would strip away the mental structures that many people relied on for basic functioning. The cure might be worse than the disease. So why do you need me? I asked. Because the old researchers kept developing resistance. They couldn't accept that humanity needed guidance. We had to retire them. But we still need someone who understands the original research, someone who can help us refine the conditioning protocols to be even more effective and more humane. And if I refuse? Blackwood smiled that cold smile again. Then you'll join your father's colleagues. But I don't think you'll refuse. You're a scientist, Elena. You understand data, and the data clearly shows that our way works. As we boarded the plane, I realised that Blackwood was offering me something that none of the other researchers had been given. A choice between cooperation and elimination. But it wasn't really a choice at all. Either I helped them perfect their system of mass psychological control, or I died. But there was a third option that Blackwood hadn't considered. The flight took us to a research facility somewhere in the mountains of Colorado. A massive complex hidden in what appeared to be a legitimate pharmaceutical company. Blackwood gave me a tour that revealed the true scope of their operation. Hundreds of researchers working on different aspects of what they called cognitive architecture management. Psychologists studying optimal conditioning patterns, programmers developing new delivery mechanisms, neuroscientists mapping the exact brain regions affected by different types of media manipulation, and in the centre of it all, a room full of servers running something called the Global Influence Engine, a system that monitored and adjusted the behavioural conditioning elements embedded in popular software in real time, based on the psychological responses of millions of users worldwide. We can influence the mood of entire populations, Blackwood explained as we watched technicians adjusting parameters on massive displays, reduce anxiety during economic uncertainty, increase compliance during political transitions, even modify consumer behaviour to prevent market instabilities. It's the most sophisticated system of social management ever created, and nobody knows it exists. That's the beauty of it. People believe they're making free choices, when in reality they're responding to psychological cues we've carefully embedded in their environment. They're happier, more stable, and more productive. Everyone wins. Blackwood assigned me an office and a research team, expecting me to begin work on improving their conditioning algorithms. But what she didn't know was that my father had taught me more than just computer science. He'd also taught me how to be patient, how to observe, and how to wait for the right moment to act. For 3 weeks, I played the part of the cooperative new researcher. I attended meetings, reviewed data, and even contributed some minor improvements to their tracking systems. But all the while, I was studying their network architecture, learning how their systems connected to the outside world, and most importantly, figuring out how to deploy my father's liberation protocol through their own distribution channels. The irony was perfect. I could use their global influence system to deliver a worldwide antidote to their psychological conditioning. But I would only get one chance, and if I failed, both the liberation protocol and I would be eliminated permanently. The opportunity came during a system upgrade. For approximately 6 hours, all conditioning algorithms would be offline while technicians installed new hardware. During that window, I would have access to the core servers without any monitoring or automatic countermeasures. I waited until 3 a.m, when the facility was mostly empty except for security guards and a skeleton crew of technicians. Then I made my way to the server room using access codes I'd memorised during my tour. The liberation protocol was stored on an encrypted drive I'd hidden inside a false bottom of my laptop case. As I connected it to the primary server, I thought about my father and all the researchers who died to keep this technology from being misused. The upload would take 45 minutes during which I would be completely vulnerable if anyone discovered what I was doing. But as the progress bar slowly filled, I realised something that made my blood run cold. The upload was proceeding too smoothly. No security alerts, no system resistance, no automatic countermeasures. They had known exactly what I was planning to do. The lights in the server room suddenly came on, and Director Catherine Blackwood walked in accompanied by 2 security guards. She didn't look surprised or angry. She looked satisfied. "Right on schedule," she said, checking her watch. 43 minutes into the upload, just as our behavioural models predicted. I stared at her, my hand still on the keyboard. "You knew?" "Of course we knew. We've been monitoring your psychological profile since the moment you received that first package. Every decision you've made, every move you've planned, has been the result of carefully crafted stimuli, designed to bring you to exactly this moment." Blackwood walked over to one of the server displays where I could see the Liberation Protocol spreading through their global network. But instead of dismantling their conditioning systems, it was being analysed, categorised, and absorbed into them. "Your father's countermeasures are brilliant," she continued, "but he made one crucial error. He assumed that resistance to conditioning was inherently good. What he didn't realise is that resistance itself can be conditioned, controlled, and directed toward desired outcomes. You're using the Liberation Protocol to make the conditioning stronger. We're using it to create the illusion of liberation while actually deepening the control. People who experience your father's cognitive freedom will believe they're thinking independently, when in reality they'll be following an even more sophisticated set of psychological directives. It's the perfect evolution of our system." I felt sick as I watched my father's life's work being perverted into exactly the kind of tool he'd been trying to fight against. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "The best part is that we didn't force you to help us. You chose to do this. Just like millions of people choose to play games that condition their minds, choose to use apps that monitor their behaviour, choose to participate in systems that gradually erode their autonomy. Free will is an illusion, Elena. People always choose the path that provides the most psychological comfort, even when that path leads to their own subjugation." "What happens to me now?" Blackwood smiled. "Now you get to make one final choice. You can join our research team permanently, with the knowledge that your father's work will be used to create a more stable and peaceful world. Or you can be eliminated, and your father's work will be used anyway. But either way, the system continues." I looked at the server display, watching as the Liberation Protocol was completely integrated into their global influence engine. Decades of my father's research, perverted into a tool for even more sophisticated mind control. But as I stared at those screens, I noticed something that Blackwood and her team had missed. The Liberation Protocol wasn't just being absorbed, it was also learning. My father had designed it to adapt and evolve, to become more effective as it encountered new forms of conditioning. And in this environment, surrounded by the most advanced psychological manipulation technology ever created, the protocol was evolving very quickly indeed. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," I said carefully. "Of course, we'll talk again tomorrow." As the security guards escorted me back to my quarters, I tried not to smile. Blackwood thought she'd won, but she'd made the same mistake that every authoritarian system eventually makes. She'd underestimated the power of genuine human resistance to adapt and overcome any form of control, no matter how sophisticated. My father hadn't just created a tool to fight conditioning. He'd created a tool that could learn to fight any conditioning, including forms of conditioning that didn't even exist yet. And now that tool was loose inside the most powerful psychological manipulation system in human history. 3 months later, I was working as a voluntary consultant for Blackwood's organisation, helping them refine their conditioning algorithms while secretly monitoring the evolution of my father's Liberation Protocol within their systems. The changes started small. Users of conditioned software began reporting unusual dreams, moments of clarity where they questioned their digital habits, sudden impulses to turn off their devices and think independently. Blackwood's team dismissed these reports as minor glitches that could be easily corrected, but the effects continued to spread and intensify. The Liberation Protocol was learning to disguise itself as part of the conditioning system, while actually creating micro moments of cognitive freedom. Brief instances where people could see through the psychological manipulation they were experiencing. Most people ignored these moments, just as Blackwood had predicted. The comfort of guided thinking was too appealing to abandon. But a small percentage of the population began to pay attention, to to question what they were experiencing, to seek out others who were having similar moments of clarity. I started receiving messages through encrypted channels, people who had somehow tracked down my identity and wanted to know if I understood what was happening to them, researchers who had noticed anomalies in their data, programmers who had found unexpected code in their systems. The resistance was growing, organically and spontaneously, exactly as my father had hoped. But Blackwood's organisation was growing too, constantly developing new forms of conditioning, new ways to maintain control over an increasingly complex global population. The war between psychological freedom and technological control was escalating, and the outcome was far from certain. As I write this, I can feel the conditioning algorithms trying to influence my thoughts, trying to guide me toward compliance and acceptance. But I can also feel my father's liberation protocol fighting back, creating space for independent thought and genuine choice. The blocks are still falling, but now I know I don't have to let them control where they land. The game is far from over, and for the first time since this all began, I believe we have a chance to win. But that's a story for another time, because some puzzles take more than one lifetime to solve, and some battles have to be fought by each generation in their own way. The question isn't whether humanity will remain free, it's whether we'll choose to be free. And that choice ultimately can't be conditioned or controlled by any system, no matter how sophisticated. It can only be made by individuals, one person at a time, one moment of clarity at a time, one act of resistance at a time. The real Tetris effect isn't about seeing falling blocks when you close your eyes. It's about recognizing the patterns that others try to impose on your mind and choosing to create your own instead. What if I told you that the world as you know it ended on December 31st, 1999? That everything since then has been a carefully constructed backup simulation? Before you click away, consider this. How many times have you experienced déjà vu? How often does history feel wrong somehow? The Mandela effect isn't just misremembering, it's the cracks showing through. Tonight's story comes from the encrypted files of a systems hacker who claimed to witness the greatest cover-up in human history. His digital footprint was scrubbed from existence, but fragments remain. What you're about to read is his confession. If you're brave enough to question reality itself, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments what conspiracy you want me to investigate next. But be warned, some truths come with a price. They told us nothing happened on New Year's Eve 1999, that 2K was a myth, an overblown panic created by paranoid programmers and opportunistic consultants. The computers didn't crash, the planes didn't fall from the sky, and civilization didn't collapse into chaos. We all woke up on January 1st, 2000, relieved and slightly embarrassed by our collective anxiety. But I know better. I watched the world end from behind a glowing monitor. The faint hum of my desktop computer fills the silence of my childhood bedroom as I type these words. Outside, I can still hear the distant echo of fireworks. Or maybe that's just the memory replaying in an endless loop. The flickering desk lamp casts dancing shadows on the wall, and in those shadows, I see the truth that everyone else has forgotten. I wasn't a paranoid conspiracy theorist. I wasn't one of those doomsday preppers hoarding canned goods and bottled water. I was a 17-year-old systems hacker with backdoor access into networks that most people didn't even know existed. I had my fingers on the pulse of the digital world's nervous system, and at 11:59 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, I felt it flatline. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, insane even. But I have proof. Fragments of code that shouldn't exist, screenshots of systems that deny their own history, and memories of a world that no longer remembers itself. The evidence is disappearing bit by bit, file by file, as the system cleans up after itself. Soon, there will be nothing left but this confession. And maybe not even that. The world I remember from before the reset was darker than what we have now, more chaotic, more real. In that original timeline, the Columbine shooting had claimed dozens more victims. The dot-com bubble had burst 6 months earlier, triggering a global recession that made the 2008 crisis look like a minor correction. Princess Diana had survived her car crash, but lived as a vegetable, sparking years of bitter custody battles over her care. The Cold War had never truly ended. It had simply gone underground, festering into proxy conflicts that threatened to escalate into nuclear exchange. By December 1999, the world was teetering on multiple precipices simultaneously. Environmental collapse, economic meltdown, and political instability were converging into a perfect storm that would have ended human civilization within a decade. The signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Mass fish die-offs that presaged oceanic ecosystem collapse, currency fluctuations that indicated coordinated attacks on the global financial system, and satellite imagery showing military build-ups in regions that the media wasn't covering. I had stumbled onto evidence of these brewing catastrophes through my digital wanderings. Corporate databases full of environmental data that painted a picture of imminent ecological death. Classified military communications discussing acceptable losses in potential nuclear exchanges, and economic models that all pointed to the same conclusion. Humanity had maybe 5 years left before everything fell apart. That's why the reset made sense. Someone or something had looked at the trajectory we were on and decided that the only way to save us was to start over, to roll back reality to a stable checkpoint and rewrite the variables that were leading to our destruction. But every correction came with a cost. Every disaster prevented meant people who should have existed were edited out of the timeline. Every war avoided meant heroes who would have emerged from that conflict never got their chance to inspire others. Every economic collapse prevented meant innovations born from necessity were never created. The world became safer, more stable, more predictable. But it also became less authentic. Less human, somehow. I sat alone in my dark bedroom at 11:58 p.m. on December 31st, 1999, bathed in the blue glow of my CRT monitor. The ancient Packard Bell computer hummed and clicked with the sound of mechanical hard drives that would soon be obsolete. My fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced precision, navigating through layers of security that had taken me months to understand and bypass. While the rest of the world prepared to celebrate the new millennium, I was deep inside a NORAD shadow server, navigating through layers of outdated relay nodes that dated back to the Cold War. The government had never bothered to properly decommission the old systems. They just built new ones on top, leaving digital fossils buried in the architecture like archaeological layers. The pathway I had discovered was almost embarrassingly simple once you knew where to look. The 1960s-era communication protocols were still active in many systems, maintained by automated processes that no living person fully understood. These ghost networks carried data that was invisible to modern monitoring systems, creating a parallel internet that existed in the spaces between official infrastructure. Finding my way into these forgotten networks had become something of an obsession. The 1980s military code was surprisingly vulnerable, written in an era when security through obscurity was considered sufficient. Most of the original programmers were long gone, retired or dead, taking their knowledge of backdoors and exploits with them. But I had patience, and I had time. Outside my window I could hear the muffled sounds of celebration. Champagne corks popping, people laughing, the countdown beginning on someone's television. Dick Clark's voice drifted through the thin walls of our suburban house, that familiar cadence building toward the moment that would change everything. The normal world, the surface world, was ready to welcome the future with open arms. But down here, in the digital underground, Something else was stirring. My screen showed a directory listing of files with names that made no sense. Strings of numbers and letters that followed no naming convention I recognised. Some were dated years in the future, others claimed to be from decades in the past. It was as if the system's internal clock had become unstuck in time, unsure of when it was supposed to be. The deeper I dug into the file structure, the more bizarre it became. I found databases that claimed to contain population records for cities that didn't exist, weather monitoring data from regions that weren't on any map. Even stranger were the personnel files, military service records for soldiers whose serial numbers followed no standard format, deployment orders to bases with names that returned no results when I searched for them. At 11:59 p.m, I noticed something strange. The network traffic began to slow, not in the way you'd expect from system overload, but like a river gradually freezing. Commands that should have executed instantly took seconds, then minutes to complete. It was as if the entire digital infrastructure was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The countdown outside grew louder. 10, 9, 8. I watched my monitor, waiting for something to happen. In the hacker community, we'd been joking about Y2K for months. The idea that computers would suddenly think it was 1900 and bring civilization to its knees seemed almost quaint. We knew better. We understood how date systems worked, how programmers had already patched the critical vulnerabilities. Y2K would be a non-event, a collective sigh of relief followed by sheepish admissions of overreaction. But something was different about the systems I was monitoring. These weren't normal corporate databases or government servers. These were deeper, older, connected to infrastructure that predated modern computing entirely. Some of the code I was seeing appeared to be written in languages that shouldn't have existed, hybrid programming constructs that combined elements from different eras of computing in ways that should have been impossible. 7, 6, 5. My screen flickered. Just once, so briefly I almost missed it. But in that moment of darkness, I saw something that made my blood freeze. For just an instant, the command prompter displayed text in a font I'd never seen before, characters that looked almost hieroglyphic before snapping back to normal. 4, 3, 2. The network traffic stopped completely. Not slowed, stopped. The data streams I'd been monitoring flatlined into perfect silence. Every connection I had established went dead simultaneously, as if someone had pulled the plug on the entire internet. But my computer was still running, still connected to something, because the screen continued to display data that was coming from nowhere. 1. At exactly midnight my monitor went black. Not the blue-black of a normal shutdown, but the deep, absolute black of something fundamental shutting down. The computer tower beside my desk continued to hum, the hard drive light still blinking occasionally, but the screen showed nothing. No cursor, no error message, no indication that the system was even trying to recover. Then I heard it, a low electrical hum rising from somewhere deep inside the walls themselves. It wasn't coming from my computer or any specific device, but from the house's electrical system, as if every wire was suddenly carrying more current than it was designed for. The overhead light flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Outside, the celebration had gone silent. I sat in perfect darkness for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, listening to that electrical hum grow stronger. It wasn't quite a sound. It was more like a vibration I could feel in my bones, a frequency that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my skull. The sensation was almost musical, like a chord being played on instruments that existed in dimensions I couldn't perceive. The silence outside was complete now. No more voices, no more music, no more sounds of celebration. Even the ambient noise of the neighbourhood, distant traffic, air conditioning units, the constant low-level hum of modern life had vanished entirely. It was as if the world itself had paused, suspended in that moment between one year and the next. Then without warning, my monitor blazed back to life. But something was wrong. The login screen that appeared wasn't the one I'd been using. The familiar blue background had been replaced with something that hurt to look at. Not because it was bright, but because the colours seemed to exist in spectrums that my eyes weren't designed to process. The timestamps were wrong. flickering between dates that made no sense, jumping from 1999 to 2000 to 1900 and back again, as if the system couldn't decide what year it was supposed to be. The familiar NORAD directory structure I'd been navigating was gone, replaced by something I'd never seen before. File names that shifted and changed as I watched them, folders that appeared and disappeared without any input from me. When I tried to access familiar locations, I found myself in digital spaces that felt infinite and empty, vast server halls that contained nothing but echoes of deleted data. Outside, the sounds of celebration slowly resumed, but they seemed distant, muffled, like they were reaching me through water. When I looked out my bedroom window, the streetlights appeared dimmer than before, and the shadows they cast fell in directions that didn't match the position of the lights themselves. I tried to reconnect to the systems I'd been monitoring, but every connection failed. Not with error messages or timeout warnings. They simply didn't respond, as if the networks themselves had vanished into digital void. When I finally managed to establish a new connection, the servers I found were identical to the ones I'd been accessing, but subtly different. Files were in slightly different locations. Security protocols had minor variations. Even the system clocks, when they finally stabilized, were running exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds slow. It was as if the entire digital world had been restored from a backup that was almost, but not quite, perfect. A backup that had been created before something terrible had happened, and now that terrible thing had been prevented by simply replacing the original with the copy. But backups are never perfect. They're snapshots of a specific moment, missing the small changes and incremental updates that occurred between backup creation and system failure. In the digital world, this manifested as corrupted files and missing data. In reality itself, it manifested as gaps in memory, alterations to physical spaces, and the persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with the world. Over the following days, I became convinced that the world had experienced something unprecedented on New Year's Eve. A complete system failure that lasted exactly 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Not just my computer, not just my house, but everything connected to the global digital infrastructure had experienced the same blackout, the same impossible pause between one reality and the next. I started researching, reaching out to other hackers and tech enthusiasts through IRC channels and bulletin boards. Most people reported nothing unusual. They'd watched the ball drop, celebrated with friends, and woken up with hangovers on New Year's Day. But a very few, mentioned strange experiences that matched elements of what I had witnessed. A systems administrator in Tokyo reported that all of his servers had simultaneously rebooted at midnight, displaying bizarre error messages in languages that didn't exist before returning to normal operation. The error messages were written in characters that resembled Chinese or Japanese, but when he showed them to linguists, they insisted the symbols followed no known grammatical rules. More disturbing still, the servers had somehow completed months of scheduled maintenance during those few minutes of downtime. Updates that should have taken hours had been implemented instantaneously. A telecommunications engineer in London noticed that several international communication satellites had briefly disappeared from tracking systems, reappearing minutes later with no explanation from the agencies that monitored them. During the blackout period, the satellites had somehow changed position, in ways that defied orbital mechanics, moving distances that should have required months of careful trajectory adjustments. When he reported the anomaly to his supervisors, he was told that the tracking data must have been corrupted and to delete his observations. But the most compelling evidence came from the financial markets. During those 7 minutes and 44 seconds, something extraordinary had happened to the global economy. Thousands of transactions had simply vanished, not cancelled or reversed, but erased from existence as if they had never occurred. Bank records showed gaps, trading logs had missing entries, and entire portfolios had been mysteriously altered. Most financial institutions dismissed these anomalies as minor Y2K-related glitches, quickly covered by insurance and forgotten. But I found patterns in the deletions that suggested something far more systematic. The vanished transactions weren't random. They followed specific criteria, as if some vast intelligence had been selectively editing the financial record. Companies that had been on the verge of bankruptcy suddenly found their books balanced through the mysterious disappearance of debt obligations. Predatory loans that would have destroyed families had vanished from mortgage databases. Stock manipulations that would have triggered market crashes had been erased, leaving no trace of the insider trading that should have been prosecuted. Nations whose economies were being destroyed by currency speculation found their exchange rates mysteriously stabilised. Sovereign debt that would have led to political upheaval had been reduced or eliminated entirely. Even individual account holders found unexpected changes. Overdraft fees reversed, credit card debts reduced, student loans modified with better terms. It was as if someone, or something, had used the Y2K transition as cover for the largest financial restructuring in human history, systematically eliminating the economic pressures that were pushing civilization toward collapse. But the changes went beyond money. Civil registry data had been altered in subtle but significant ways that suggested a comprehensive rewriting of recent history. Birth records, death certificates, immigration documents, all had been modified according to patterns I couldn't fully decipher, but which seemed designed to reduce social tensions and prevent future conflicts. Some people found their official birth dates had shifted by days or weeks, changing their astrological signs or moving them out of demographic categories that would have made them targets for discrimination. Others discovered that relatives they remembered had no legal record of existence, as if family members who would have created problems or inherited genetic diseases had been edited out of the bloodline entirely. Marriage records had been altered to eliminate unions that would have ended in domestic violence. Divorce papers showed different custody arrangements that better protected children. Even traffic records had been modified. DUI convictions that would have led to job losses had been reduced to lesser charges. Accident reports had been altered to reduce insurance payouts that would have bankrupted families. Maps were wrong too. Not obviously wrong. The major cities were still in the right places. The coastlines hadn't shifted dramatically. But the details were off in ways that suggested systematic urban planning improvements. Street layouts that I remembered clearly had been altered to improve traffic flow and reduce accident rates. Buildings that should have existed were absent from satellite imagery, replaced by green spaces or structures that served the community better. Even the GPS coordinates of familiar landmarks had shifted by small but measurable amounts, as if the entire continent had been nudged slightly to optimize weather patterns and reduce the frequency of natural disasters. Fault lines had been moved to reduce earthquake risk. River courses had been adjusted to prevent flooding. Coastlines had been reinforced against erosion and tsunami damage. When I tried to verify these discrepancies using archived data, I hit another wall. The backup systems that should have contained pre-Y2K records were either corrupted, missing, or showed the same alterations as the current data. It was as if the entire historical record had been systematically updated to match the new reality, eliminating any evidence that things had ever been different. Internet archives that should have contained snapshots of websites from before the reset showed pages that had been subtly modified. News articles had different headlines, different casualty figures, different outcomes to events I distinctly remembered. Even personal websites and blogs had been altered to remove references to problems that had apparently been solved before they could manifest. The most disturbing discovery came when I compared my personal files from before New Year's Eve with the official records. Photos I'd taken of friends and family showed faces that no longer matched their driver's licenses. Not dramatically different, but altered in small ways that made them more attractive, healthier, happier. Names I'd saved in my contact database belonged to people who insisted I'd always called them something else, often names that sounded more socially acceptable or carried fewer negative associations. Even academic records had been modified. Grades had been improved across the board, not to the point of absurdity, but enough to open doors that would have remained closed. Disciplinary records had been softened or eliminated. Student loan amounts had been reduced to manageable levels. Standardised test scores had been boosted just enough to qualify for better colleges and opportunities. I began to suspect that Y2K hadn't been a potential disaster at all. It had been a deliberate reset, a chance for some unknown force to edit reality itself, and eliminate the sources of human suffering that were leading us towards civilizational collapse. The blackout, those missing 7 minutes and 44 seconds, had been the upload time for a new version of the world. A version where the variables that led to disaster had been carefully adjusted to produce better outcomes. But if that was true, what had been wrong with the original version that required such drastic intervention? And who or what had the power to change reality on such a fundamental level? More importantly, what happened to the people who remembered how things used to be? My obsession with finding evidence of the pre-reset world consumed the next decade of my life. I became a digital archaeologist, hunting through abandoned servers and forgotten backup tapes for what I started calling ghost fragments, pieces of code and data that remembered the world as it used to be, before the Great Edit had optimized everything for stability and reduced suffering. The hunt took me to the darkest corners of the internet, places where old systems went to die, and digital memories lingered long after their original purposes had been forgotten. I learned to navigate defunct corporate servers still humming in abandoned office buildings, powered by automated systems that continued their work years after the companies that created them had gone bankrupt or been absorbed by larger entities. University mainframes that had been forgotten during budget cuts became my specialty. Academic institutions were notoriously bad at decommissioning old equipment, often simply unplugging systems and leaving them in basement storage rooms where they continued to run on emergency power. These forgotten machines contained vast archives of research data, student records, and communication logs that hadn't been updated since the reset. Military installations were more challenging, but often more rewarding. Bases where the original programmers had retired or died without passing on access codes contained the most pristine examples of pre-reset data. The military's obsession with redundancy meant that critical information was often stored in multiple formats across different systems, and while the primary databases had been updated, backup systems sometimes retained the original versions. In these digital graveyards, I found fragments of the original timeline that painted a picture of a world that had been on the verge of collapse. Medical databases contained patient records for people who no longer existed, not dead, but simply absent from current reality. I found appointment schedules for doctors who had never been born, insurance claims for treatments that were no longer possible because the diseases they treated had been retroactively cured or prevented. Pharmaceutical research databases showed development timelines for drugs that had never been created, designed to treat conditions that no longer occurred with sufficient frequency to justify the investment. The most haunting discoveries were in pediatric hospitals. I found records of children with genetic conditions that had somehow been eliminated from their family lines, medical charts that showed progressive diseases that had been stopped mid-progression, treatment plans for young patients who had apparently been cured retroactively by changes to their genetic history. The cost of these miracles was that the parents of these children often had no memory of the medical struggles they had endured, living in a reality where their families had always been healthy and whole. Corporate archives held employment records for companies that had never existed, not failed businesses, but enterprises that had been prevented from forming in the first place. I found project files for products that had never been developed, because the social problems they were designed to solve had been eliminated at the source. Email chains discussed market research for demographic groups that no longer existed, management strategies for dealing with economic conditions that had been prevented. Movie studios had casting notes for films that weren't in any current filmography, scripts that dealt with social issues that were no longer relevant because the underlying problems had been edited out of history. Publishers had manuscript submissions for books that had never been written, novels that explored themes of desperation and survival that were no longer relatable to audiences living in the optimized reality. Television networks had development documents for news programs that covered wars that had never happened, environmental disasters that had been prevented, political scandals involving leaders who had never risen to power. The archives revealed an entire parallel entertainment industry that had been designing content for a much darker timeline, one where human suffering provided endless material for drama and documentary. But the most disturbing discoveries were personal. In the vast digital archives of social media platforms, that were just beginning to emerge in the early 2000s, I found profiles and posts from people I remembered knowing, friends, classmates, even family members, who now insisted they had never met me. Their accounts showed a history of interactions with someone whose name had been scrubbed from the servers, leaving only empty spaces where conversations should have been. I found photo albums with gaps where pictures of certain people should have been. Not deleted images, but spaces that had never contained photos at all, as if the absent individuals had never existed to be photographed. Status updates referenced experiences and events that involved people who were no longer part of reality, creating nonsensical posts about shared activities with friends who had never been born. Dating websites contained profiles that referenced relationship histories with partners who couldn't be found in any database. Professional networking sites showed career connections to colleagues whose employment records showed no overlap with the people who claimed to know them. Even genealogy websites had been altered, showing family trees that had been pruned to remove branches that led to problematic outcomes. I began documenting these anomalies obsessively, building a comprehensive database of inconsistencies between the current world and the fragments I could recover. The pattern that emerged was both incredible and terrifying. Reality had been edited with surgical precision, removing elements that threatened stability while preserving everything else as much as possible. Natural disasters that should have killed millions had been prevented or minimized through small changes to weather patterns, geological structures and emergency response systems. Political leaders who would have started wars had never risen to power, often because the social conditions that would have supported them had been eliminated decades earlier. Economic collapses that would have destroyed entire nations had been averted through subtle changes to market conditions, regulatory frameworks, and international trade agreements. Even individual tragedies had been undone, fatal accidents prevented through minor changes to traffic patterns and road construction, terminal illnesses cured through genetic modifications that traced back generations, personal failures transformed into successes through small adjustments to educational opportunities and social connections. It was as if some benevolent force had identified every potential source of human suffering and systematically eliminated it from the timeline, working backward through cause and effect chains to find the minimal changes needed to produce optimal outcomes. But there was a cost that became more apparent as my investigation deepened. The people who had been removed from reality to prevent these disasters hadn't simply died. They had never existed. Their contributions to human knowledge, art, and culture had vanished with them. Scientific breakthroughs that would have saved different lives were never made because the researchers who would have made them were edited out of the timeline. Works of art that would have inspired generations were never created because the artists who would have produced them were prevented from being born. Love stories that would have produced children were never begun, eliminating entire family lines to prevent genetic diseases or psychological problems that would have manifested generations later. Teachers who would have inspired students to greatness were removed from the timeline, along with the innovations and discoveries that would have resulted from their influence. Even criminals and villains had been systematically prevented from existing, taking with them the heroes who would have risen to oppose them and the social progress that often emerged from confronting evil. The world had been optimized for stability and reduced suffering, but in the process, it had lost something essential: the chaotic, unpredictable, beautiful mess of authentic human existence. The rough edges had been smoothed away, the sharp contrasts had been softened, and the result was a reality that was undeniably better in measurable ways, but somehow less real, less vivid, less alive. And I was beginning to realise that my investigation itself might be a threat to this carefully constructed paradise. The ghost fragments I'd been collecting were disappearing at an accelerating rate. Files I'd successfully downloaded and archived would corrupt themselves overnight, displaying nothing but random characters when I tried to access them again. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures, wiping themselves clean at the moment I tried to copy critical data. Even screenshots I'd taken of important discoveries would become unreadable, as if the very act of documenting the evidence triggered some kind of defensive response. More disturbing still, the people I tried to share my discoveries with would forget our conversations within days, sometimes within hours. Friends who had initially shown interest in my research would later deny that we'd ever discussed it, looking at me with genuine confusion when I mentioned their previous enthusiasm. Family members who had helped me search for anomalies would look at me with concern when I referenced their assistance, insisting that they had never been involved in any such investigation. It was as if the system was actively defending itself, using the same reality editing capabilities that had created the reset to eliminate threats to its stability. And with each fragment I uncovered, each inconsistency I documented, I was marking myself as a more significant threat that required more comprehensive countermeasures. The breadcrumbs I'd been leaving online, forum posts describing my findings, encrypted files stored on anonymous servers, even simple emails outlining my theories, were vanishing faster than I could create them. Entire websites I'd used to store backups would disappear overnight, their domains returning site not found errors as if they had never existed. Social media posts would be deleted not just from my accounts, but from the accounts of anyone who had shared or commented on them. I realised I was fighting a war against reality itself and I was losing. But I also realised that the very fact that I could perceive this war meant that I had somehow survived the reset with my memories intact, making me one of the few people who could serve as witness to what had really happened. Whether that was an accident or part of some larger plan, I couldn't determine, but I knew that my time was running out. The system was learning to counter my efforts more effectively with each attempt I made to preserve evidence. Soon, it would move beyond simply erasing my discoveries and begin erasing me. By 2010, 11 years after the reset, I had developed a comprehensive theory about what had really happened on New Year's Eve 1999 and who had been responsible for the greatest editing of reality in human history. With 2K hadn't been a bug, it had been a fail-safe mechanism, a last resort activation code built into the global digital infrastructure by entities I could only call the architects. The evidence I had accumulated suggested that humanity had reached a critical error state by the end of 1999, a convergence of cascading failures that would have led to the complete collapse of human civilization within a decade. The global economy was on the verge of a meltdown that would have made the Great Depression look like a minor recession. Environmental degradation was accelerating beyond any recoverable limits, with multiple ecosystem collapses triggering feedback loops that would have rendered the planet uninhabitable. Most critically, our increasing dependence on fragile technological systems had created cascading failure points that could have ended modern civilization with a single catastrophic malfunction. Political tensions were building toward conflicts that would have made World War III inevitable. Nuclear proliferation had reached a point where multiple non-state actors had access to weapons of mass destruction. Social inequalities had grown to levels that historically preceded revolutions and societal collapse. Disease outbreaks were becoming more frequent and more resistant to treatment, suggesting that a global pandemic capable of ending human civilization was imminent. The architects, whether they were human agencies operating in complete secrecy, artificial intelligences that had achieved consciousness decades earlier than anyone suspected, or something else entirely, had been monitoring these failure conditions through the global digital infrastructure that was becoming increasingly integrated into every aspect of human activity. They had run the projections, calculated the probabilities, and reached the same conclusion that my own research had suggested. Without intervention, human civilization would end before 2010. When the convergent crises reached a mathematical certainty of complete collapse, they activated the reset protocol. The 7 minutes and 44 seconds of blackout hadn't been a system failure. It had been an upload period, a moment when the architects implemented a new version of reality where the critical errors had been corrected through targeted modifications to the timeline. The duration was significant, long enough to implement comprehensive changes across multiple systems and data archives, but short enough to avoid creating obvious gaps in human memory that would have made the edit detectable to most observers. This theory explained many of the anomalies I had discovered, including the accelerated technological development of the 21st century. Smartphones, social media platforms, advanced internet infrastructure, GPS systems, medical imaging technology, Innovations that should have taken decades to develop were suddenly available within a few years of the reset. It was as if the architects had compressed technological advancement, giving humanity tools to manage the complexities of modern civilization more effectively and prevent the conditions that had led to the original timeline's collapse. The compression wasn't just technological but temporal. Events that should have unfolded gradually over decades were happening in compressed timeframes, as if history itself was running at an accelerated pace to reach stable endpoints more quickly. Cultural changes that should have taken generations occurred within years. Political movements that should have required decades to mature reached full development within electoral cycles. Even individual human development seemed accelerated, with people reaching emotional and intellectual milestones faster than historical norms suggested they should. But the compression had side effects that became more apparent as I studied the patterns of change. Time itself felt different after 2000, more fluid, less substantial, less anchored to physical reality. Events seemed to unfold with unnatural speed, following narrative structures that were too clean, too purposeful, too optimized for dramatic effect. The pace of innovation was almost impossibly rapid, with breakthrough discoveries happening at a rate that suggested they were being introduced according to a predetermined schedule, rather than emerging from natural scientific inquiry. The 21st century felt less like natural historical progression, and more like a carefully scripted sequence of events designed to guide humanity toward specific outcomes. Wars ended more quickly and cleanly than historical patterns suggested they should. Economic crises were resolved through mechanisms that appeared almost overnight. Social problems were addressed by solutions that seemed to materialize just when they were needed most. I began to suspect that the 21st century wasn't happening in real time at all, but was instead a carefully coded simulation running at accelerated speed to bring humanity to a stable endpoint as quickly as possible. The déjà vu experiences that became increasingly common after Y2K weren't just psychological phenomena, they were processing errors, moments when the simulation briefly revealed its underlying structure to conscious observers. The Mandela effect, which wouldn't be widely recognised and named until years later, was actually evidence of ongoing system maintenance. When large numbers of people remembered events differently than the official record showed, it wasn't false memory. It was remnants of previous versions of the timeline bleeding through the code. The system was constantly making minor adjustments to optimize outcomes, and these adjustments sometimes left traces in human memory that didn't match the updated official version of events. But understanding the system and fighting it were two different challenges entirely. The more I learned about the architect's modifications, the more I realized how comprehensive and sophisticated their control had become. They hadn't just edited history. They had created a self-maintaining reality that could automatically detect and correct for new threats to stability. Every time I made a significant discovery, every time I found evidence that could expose the true nature of our reality, the system would respond with countermeasures, not dramatically, not in ways that would create obvious paradoxes or logical inconsistencies, but subtly, carefully, rewriting the context around my discoveries until they appeared meaningless, delusional, or simply mistaken. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than directly contradicting evidence of the reset, the system would alter the circumstances surrounding that evidence. Witnesses would develop memory problems or psychological conditions that made their testimony unreliable. Documents would be discovered to have been created by known hoaxers or discredited researchers. Physical evidence would be revealed to have mundane explanations that made conspiracy theories seem ridiculous. I was beginning to understand that my investigation itself might have been anticipated, even planned for by the architects. Perhaps they needed someone to remember the original timeline, to serve as a reference point for their ongoing modifications. Perhaps my resistance was actually serving their purposes in ways I couldn't comprehend, providing feedback that helped them refine their reality editing algorithms. Or perhaps I was simply a bug in their code, a corrupted file that had somehow survived the reset but was slowly being debugged out of existence through increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. The evidence suggested that the architects were not merely powerful, but were operating on a level of technological sophistication that bordered on godlike. They could edit reality retroactively, alter human memory, and manipulate physical matter at the quantum level. They could predict the long-term consequences of small changes across vast networks of cause and effect. They could coordinate modifications across multiple timelines simultaneously, but they were not omniscient or omnipotent. The fact that my memories had survived the reset, that ghost fragments of the original timeline could still be found in forgotten databases, suggested that their control had limits. They could edit reality, but they couldn't completely rewrite it without creating inconsistencies that might expose their intervention. They needed reality to appear natural, authentic, believable. They needed people to accept the edited version of the world as the only version that had ever existed, and that requirement created vulnerabilities that a determined investigator could exploit. The question was whether I could exploit those vulnerabilities before the system completed its debugging process and eliminated me entirely. The breakthrough came in 2015, 16 years after the reset, when I finally cracked the encryption on a series of files I'd recovered from a decommissioned military satellite. The satellite had been part of an early warning system for nuclear attacks, launched in the 1970s and officially decommissioned in 1998. But like many military systems, it had never actually been turned off. It continued to orbit Earth, collecting and storing data according to its original programming, invisible to modern tracking systems that didn't know to look for it. The data contained what appeared to be source code, not for any software I recognised, but for something far more fundamental. It was code for reality itself. The files were massive, containing algorithms that described not just physical laws and mathematical constants, but human behaviour, historical patterns, and what could only be described as narrative structure. It was as if the universe itself was running on a sophisticated program, one that could be modified and updated like any other software system, with reality serving as both the operating system and the user interface. The code was written in a language that combined elements from every programming paradigm I had ever encountered, with additional constructs that seemed to operate according to principles I couldn't fully comprehend. Variables represented abstract concepts like historical momentum, causal density, and narrative coherence. Functions manipulated not just data, but the fundamental relationships between events, people, and outcomes. Within this code, I found references to error correction protocols and stability maintenance subroutines that operated continuously in the background of reality, monitoring for conditions that could lead to timeline instability. There were variables for historical consistency, causal coherence, and something called observer compliance, the system's ability to ensure that conscious beings accepted the reality they were experiencing as authentic and natural. Most chilling of all, I found a directory labelled deprecated entities, a vast database of people, places and events that had been removed from the active timeline. The database was searchable, and I spent weeks combing through it, finding friends, family members, even entire historical events that had been edited out of existence. Each entry contained not just the basic information about what had been removed, but detailed analysis of the causal chains that had made removal necessary. I found records of my childhood friend Marcus, who had died in a car accident when we were 15. According to the database, Marcus hadn't been removed because of his death, but because he would have survived the accident and gone on to become a brilliant engineer who developed a revolutionary new battery technology. The problem was that his invention would have been misused by a terrorist organisation to create portable nuclear devices, leading to attacks that would have killed millions. Rather than prevent the specific misuse, the system had chosen to prevent Marcus from existing at all, along with his potential contributions to both beneficial and harmful technologies. My high school girlfriend Sarah was listed as deprecated because she would have become an investigative journalist who exposed government corruption related to environmental cover-ups. Her reporting would have triggered a political crisis that led to the collapse of several democratic governments and their replacement by authoritarian regimes. The cost of saving the environment through her work would have been the loss of human freedom across multiple continents. Even more disturbing were the entries for people I had never known existed. Family members who had been edited out of my bloodline before I was born, potential siblings who had been prevented from being conceived, grandparents whose life stories had been altered to prevent them from passing on genetic predispositions or psychological traits that would have made their descendants less stable or happy. The database contained millions of such entries, each representing a person whose existence had been deemed too costly to the overall stability of the timeline. But it also contained entries for positive elements that had been enhanced or created. People who had been made more attractive, more intelligent, more emotionally stable than they would have been naturally. Historical figures whose accomplishments had been amplified through subtle changes to their circumstances and capabilities. But my greatest mistake was assuming that my access to these files was accidental. As I dug deeper into the code, I began to notice references to something called the Observer Protocol. This appeared to be a special subroutine designed to handle individuals who became aware of the system's existence, people who developed the ability to perceive the artificial nature of their reality, despite the programming designed to prevent such awareness. The protocol was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Instead of immediately deleting aware individuals from the timeline, which could create obvious gaps that might make other observers suspicious, the system would gradually edit their credibility, their relationships, and finally their existence itself over an extended period. The process was designed to look natural. The affected individual would appear to descend into paranoid delusion, gradually alienating friends and family with increasingly bizarre theories about reality manipulation. Their evidence would be systematically discredited or destroyed. Their support networks would be eroded through subtle manipulation of social dynamics, and their mental health would be undermined through targeted psychological pressure. Eventually, they would become so isolated and discredited that their complete disappearance would seem like a logical conclusion to their mental deterioration. Friends and family would remember them as troubled individuals who had lost touch with reality, making their absence feel like a relief rather than a tragedy. The few people who might have supported their theories would be dealt with through similar but less intensive applications of the protocol. I realised with growing horror that I had been following this script perfectly for the past 16 years. My obsession with the reset, my alienation from friends and family, my increasingly desperate attempts to document evidence that kept disappearing, it was all part of the Observer Protocol's execution. Every move I had made, every discovery I had celebrated, every moment of apparent progress in my investigation had been anticipated and accounted for in the system's response algorithms. But knowing about the protocol didn't free me from it. If anything, awareness of the process seemed to accelerate its implementation. The reality edits became more frequent and more dramatic. People who had known me for decades began to deny that we'd ever met, not just forgetting our conversations about the reset, but forgetting me entirely. Photographs of me started disappearing from family albums, leaving empty spaces where I should have been. Even official records, my birth certificate, school transcripts, tax returns, employment history, began showing inconsistencies that gradually erased my legal existence. Social security numbers that returned no matches in government databases. Bank accounts that were frozen not for any legal reason, but because the institutions had no record of my identity. Credit reports that showed financial activity for someone who apparently didn't exist. I tried to fight back by creating multiple backups of my research, storing files across dozens of different servers and platforms, using encryption techniques that should have been unbreakable. But the system was faster and more thorough than I could ever be. Data would corrupt itself the moment I tried to access it, displaying only random characters or error messages. Email accounts would be mysteriously closed for terms of service violations that were never specified. Even handwritten notes would fade as if the ink itself was defective, leaving only blank pages where crucial information had been recorded. More sophisticated attempts to preserve evidence failed in ways that seemed to mock my efforts. Backup drives would develop mysterious hardware failures that destroyed their contents without damaging the devices themselves. Cloud storage services would report that my files had never been uploaded, despite confirmation emails proving that they had been successfully stored. Even physical photographs would fade or become mysteriously damaged, as if the reality editing could extend to manipulating matter itself. In desperation, I began leaving digital breadcrumbs in online forums, encrypted messages hidden in image files, encoded warnings embedded in seemingly innocent comments on social media. But even these were being systematically hunted down and eliminated by algorithms that seemed capable of detecting subversive content, regardless of how cleverly it was disguised. The system's response became increasingly aggressive as my activities escalated. Not only were my own efforts being countered, but anyone who showed interest in my theories began experiencing similar effects. Forum posts asking questions about Y2K anomalies would be deleted by moderators who claimed they violated community guidelines. Users who tried to download my encrypted files would find that their internet connections mysteriously failed during the transfer. Even casual conversations about strange memories from around the year 2000 would be interrupted by distractions or forgotten entirely. I realised that the Observer Protocol was not just targeting me, but was creating a quarantine zone around anyone who came into contact with reality-threatening information. The system was protecting itself by ensuring that dangerous knowledge could not spread beyond the original infected individual. But the most disturbing revelation came when I found my own entry in the deprecated entities database. According to the file, I had been scheduled for removal from the timeline years earlier, but my deletion had been postponed indefinitely due to my classification as a useful aberration. The system was keeping me alive not because it couldn't eliminate me, but because my investigation was serving some purpose in its larger operational framework. I had become a controlled opposition, a safety valve that allowed the system to monitor and contain potential threats to its stability. My research was being permitted to continue because it helped the architects identify weaknesses in their reality editing algorithms. Every method I discovered for detecting anomalies was being studied and countered, making their future interventions more seamless and undetectable. My entire investigation, my years of searching for truth, my desperate attempts to warn others about the nature of our reality, it had all been part of an elaborate debugging process. I was an unwitting beta tester for reality manipulation technology, helping to refine the very system I was trying to expose. The system was closing in, and I was running out of time. But knowing that my elimination was inevitable gave me a strange kind of freedom. If I was going to be deleted from reality, I might as well make my final actions count for something. I began planning one last desperate attempt to break through the system's defences and leave behind evidence that could survive my erasure. The final phase began on December 31st, 2015, exactly 16 years after the original reset. I had been documenting my research obsessively, aware that each day might be my last, when the reality edits suddenly accelerated beyond anything I had experienced before. The system had apparently decided that my usefulness as a debugging tool had been exhausted, and it was time to implement the final stage of the Observer Protocol. I woke up that morning to find that my name had been removed from the lease agreement on my apartment. The landlord, someone I'd been paying rent to for 3 years, looked at me with genuine confusion when I tried to explain the situation. According to his records, the apartment had been vacant for months, and he had no memory of ever meeting me. When I showed him bank statements proving my rent payments, he stared at them as if they were forgeries, unable to reconcile the financial records with his complete lack of memory regarding our landlord-tenant relationship. My bank accounts were frozen, not for any legal reason that the institutions could explain, but because the banks had no record of my existence. My social security number returned no matches in government databases. Credit reporting agencies had no files associated with my identity. Even utility companies claimed that my address had never had service in my name, despite years of bills and payment confirmations that I could produce as evidence. The erasure was happening in real time, with records being modified even as I tried to access them. I would log into an account, confirm that my information was present and correct, then refresh the page to find that all references to my identity had vanished. Customer service representatives would start conversations acknowledging my account, then become confused mid-sentence as the data disappeared from their screens while we were talking. But the most devastating change was with my family. When I went to my mother's house, desperately seeking some anchor to reality, she answered the door as if I were a stranger. Not the careful politeness of someone who had forgotten an acquaintance, but the genuine bewilderment of someone confronted by a complete stranger who claimed intimate knowledge of their life. Her face showed no recognition, no spark of familiarity, no indication that she had ever seen me before in her life. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with concern for my apparent mental state, "but I think you have me confused with someone else. I never had any children." I showed her photographs of us together, pointed to family mementos that I'd given her over the years, recounted shared memories from my childhood with perfect accuracy. But she looked at the photos and saw empty spaces where I should have been, as if the images had been edited to remove my presence while leaving subtle shadows and positioning that proved someone had been there. The gifts I had given her had different origin stories, presents from friends whose names she couldn't quite remember, items she'd bought herself during shopping trips that she recalled with unusual vagueness. When I described specific events from our shared history, family vacations, birthday celebrations, conversations we'd had just weeks earlier, she listened with the patient concern of someone dealing with a delusional stranger. The events I described had happened, but in her memory, they had involved other people or had occurred differently. Family gatherings had taken place without me. Holidays had been celebrated in my absence. Important family milestones had been reached without my participation. The reality editing had reached the point where my existence was being retroactively removed from the timeline. I wasn't just being forgotten. I was being systematically deleted from history itself, with the changes propagating backward through time to create a consistent narrative in which I had never been born. In panic, I tried to contact others who might remember me. Friends from school, former co-workers, even casual acquaintances from online communities. But I found that my phone no longer worked. Not broken or damaged, simply unable to connect to any network, as if my device was no longer authorized to exist on the communication grid. The phone would show full signal strength, but would fail to complete any calls, with error messages claiming that the numbers I was trying to reach did not exist. Internet access became equally problematic. My computer could connect to networks, but websites would fail to load properly, displaying broken layouts and missing content, as if my presence was corrupting the data transfer. Social media platforms would refuse to load my profiles, or would display error messages claiming that my accounts had been suspended for terms of service violations that were never specified. I rushed back to my apartment, hoping to salvage what remained of my research, but found that the building's security system no longer recognized my keycards or even my biometric data. The electronic locks that had opened for me thousands of times now acted as if I was a complete stranger, attempting unauthorized entry. The guards didn't throw me out. They simply couldn't see me, their eyes sliding past me as if I were invisible, unable to focus on my presence even when I stood directly in front of them. This was the most disturbing aspect of the erasure process. I wasn't just being removed from records and memories. I was being edited out of other people's perception. I was becoming a ghost, visible only to myself, unable to interact with a world that was forgetting I had ever existed. The few people who could still see me treated me as if I was a hallucination or a figment of their imagination. A homeless man I tried to talk to looked through me as if I wasn't there, then suddenly jerked his head around as if he had heard a voice but couldn't locate its source. A child playing in a park briefly made eye contact with me, then ran to her mother claiming that she had seen the invisible man, only to be told that she was letting her imagination run wild. Even security cameras seemed unable to record my presence. I could see myself in mirrors and reflective surfaces, but surveillance footage would show empty spaces where I should have been, creating the impossible impression that I was a vampire or some other supernatural entity that couldn't be captured on film. In desperation, I broke into an internet cafe, using an old-fashioned computer that might not be connected to the systems that were hunting me. The machine was ancient by 2015 standards, running software that predated many of the modern network protocols that seemed to be blocking my access. I had perhaps minutes before the reality edits caught up with this location, before my presence here was also erased from possibility. My hands shook as I typed what I knew would be my final message, my last chance to warn someone about what was happening. But even as I typed, I could feel my thoughts becoming fuzzy, my memories becoming uncertain. The system wasn't just erasing my existence, it was editing my consciousness itself, making me forget who I had been and what I had discovered. The words on the screen began to blur, not physically but conceptually, as if their meaning was becoming uncertain. I could see the letters, but their significance was slipping away from me like water through my fingers. The knowledge I'd spent 16 years accumulating was being systematically deleted from my mind, leaving only confusion and growing amnesia. I fought to maintain focus, to hold on to the core message long enough to complete it. The world had ended in 1999. Everything since then had been a backup simulation. The system was watching, always watching, and when it detected threats to its stability, it would implement the Observer Protocol. People who remembered too much would be gradually erased, first from records, then from memory, finally from existence itself. But even as I typed these warnings, I could feel them becoming meaningless. The concepts that had driven my investigation for 16 years were dissolving, leaving only the vague impression that something was wrong with the world, something that I could no longer articulate or even fully remember. The screen flickered. My vision became uncertain. I could no longer remember why I was sitting at this computer or what I had been trying to type. The words on the screen looked like random characters, devoid of meaning or context. Somewhere in the distance I heard the sound of fireworks. Or maybe it was just memory, the echo of a celebration from a lifetime ago, when the world had ended and been replaced with something better, safer, more stable. But somewhere in the deepest part of my fading consciousness, I held on to one last thought. If someone reads this, if these words somehow survive the erasure, then maybe the truth can still... Good evening, and welcome to Sleep Theories. Before we dive into tonight's story, I'm curious about you, our listeners. How has your day been treating you? Are you winding down after a long day? Or perhaps you're on the other side of the world, just beginning your morning routine. What time is it where you are right now? And what corner of our vast planet are you calling home tonight? Whether you're listening from a bustling city apartment, a quiet countryside home, or somewhere in between, you're part of our global community of truth seekers and story lovers. If you're new to Sleep Theories, welcome aboard. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for coming back. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. We have so many more mysteries to uncover together, and your subscription helps us bring these stories to light. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a tale that will make you question everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous disasters. Tonight, we're going beneath the surface of the North Atlantic, not just to explore the wreckage of a legendary ship, but to uncover a conspiracy so massive, so carefully orchestrated, that it may have shaped the course of world history. This is the story of the Titanic switch, the theory that suggests the ship that sank on that fateful April night in 1912 was never the Titanic at all. April 14th, 1912. Picture this night in your mind. The North Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, a black mirror reflecting nothing but stars. There is no moon to illuminate the waters, leaving the ocean in an almost supernatural darkness. The temperature has dropped to just below freezing, and the sea is unusually calm, so still that veterans of these waters would later describe it as eerily unnatural. Cutting through this obsidian expanse is the largest moving object ever created by human hands. The RMS Titanic, all 882 feet of her, pushes through the water at nearly 23 knots. Her 4 massive smokestacks pierce the star-filled sky, sending columns of smoke and sparks into the night. From her decks, the warm glow of electric light spills out onto the water, creating the only source of illumination for miles in any direction. Inside this floating palace, over 2,000 souls are living what many believe to be their final hours, though they don't know it yet. In the first-class dining saloon, passengers in evening wear are finishing their 10-course dinner, completely unaware that they are dining aboard what will become history's most famous maritime disaster. The ship's orchestra plays ragtime melodies that drift through the corridors, mixing with the sound of laughter, conversation, and the ever-present thrumming of the engines deep below. Captain Edward Smith stands on the bridge, a veteran of the seas with 40 years of experience behind him. This is meant to be his final voyage before retirement, a triumphant capstone to a distinguished career. He has commanded ships for the White Star Line for decades, earning the nickname Millionaire's Captain for his skill in handling the luxury vessels that carry the world's elite across the Atlantic. Tonight he commands not just any ship, but the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet, the unsinkable Titanic. But at 11:39 p.m. ship's time, everything changes in an instant. Frederick Fleet, the lookout stationed in the crow's nest, spots something emerging from the darkness ahead. Without the aid of binoculars, which, mysteriously, are locked away and unavailable to the lookouts that night, he strains his eyes against the blackness. What he sees sends ice through his veins. A massive iceberg, dark and silent, looms directly in the ship's path. "Iceberg right ahead," Fleet shouts into the telephone that connects him to the bridge. First Officer William Murdoch receives the warning and immediately orders hard a starboard and full astern. The helmsman spins the wheel, and the engine room receives the telegraph signal to reverse engines. For 37 seconds, the fate of over 2,000 people hangs in the balance as the massive ship begins to turn. But it's too late. The Titanic's starboard side scrapes along the iceberg with what survivors would later describe as a sound like thunder, though to many passengers it felt like nothing more than a slight shudder. Some passengers on the lower decks report chunks of ice falling onto the deck, and a few even gather pieces as souvenirs, joking about their close call with the ice. They have no idea that their ship is already doomed. Below the waterline, the iceberg has opened up the first 5 compartments of the ship's hull. The Titanic was designed to survive flooding in up to 4 compartments, but 5 is too many. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who is aboard for this maiden voyage, quickly calculates the mathematics of disaster. With 5 compartments flooding, the ship will inevitably sink by the bow, pulling the rest of the vessel down with her. "How long do we have?" Captain Smith asks Andrews. "An hour, 2 at most." And so begins one of the most studied, documented and debated disasters in human history. Over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, the unsinkable ship will break apart and slip beneath the waves, taking with her over 1,500 souls. The survivors will tell stories of heroism and cowardice, of the band playing hymns as the ship tilted toward her grave, of the insufficient lifeboats and the icy water that killed most victims within minutes. This is the story we all know. This is the official narrative that has been told and retold for over a century. But what if everything we think we know about that night is wrong? What if the ship that struck the iceberg and sank in the North Atlantic was never the Titanic at all? What if the real conspiracy began not in the aftermath of the disaster, but months before, in the shipyards of Belfast, where two sister ships sat side by side, and where a desperate plan was hatched to save a failing company from financial ruin? What if the disaster that shocked the world was not an accident, but the culmination of the most audacious insurance fraud ever attempted? Tonight, we're going to explore a theory that suggests the Titanic disaster was not just a tragedy, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy involving some of the most powerful men in the world. We're going to examine evidence that points to a massive cover-up, one that may have claimed the lives of over 1,500 innocent people in service of greed, power, and political manipulation. This is the story of the Titanic switch, and by the end of our journey together, you may never look at this famous disaster the same way again. To understand the theory of the Titanic switch, we must first travel back to the shipyards of Belfast, Ireland, where two virtually identical ships were taking shape side by side. The story begins not with disaster, but with dreams of maritime supremacy and the fierce competition between the great shipping lines of the early 20th century. Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast was, at the time, one of the premier shipbuilding facilities in the world. The massive facility sprawled along the banks of the River Lagan, its enormous gantry cranes towering over the landscape like steel monuments to industrial ambition. It was here, in this cathedral of steel and rivets, that the White Star Line had commissioned 3 ships that would change ocean travel forever. The Olympic-class ships, as they would be known, were conceived as the ultimate expression of luxury and engineering prowess. These were to be the largest, most opulent vessels ever built, designed to dominate the lucrative North Atlantic passenger route and crush the competition from rival shipping companies like Cunard Line. The first of these sister ships was the RMS Olympic, launched on October the 20th, 1910. She was a marvel of engineering, stretching 882 feet from bow to stern and weighing over 46,000 tons. Her 9 decks could accommodate over 2,000 passengers in unprecedented luxury, with amenities that included a swimming pool, a gymnasium, a Turkish bath, and dining rooms that rivaled the finest restaurants in London or New York. The Olympic was not just a ship. She was a floating city, a testament to British engineering and a symbol of the White Star Line's dominance of the seas. When she departed Southampton on her maiden voyage in June 1911, she carried with her the hopes and reputation of her builders. But less than 4 months after her maiden voyage, disaster struck. On September the 20th, 1911, the Olympic was departing Southampton when she collided with HMS Hawke, a Royal Navy cruiser. The impact was devastating. The Hawke's reinforced bow, designed to ram enemy vessels, punched a massive hole in the Olympic's starboard side, flooding 2 of her compartments and severely damaging her propeller shaft. The Olympic limped back to port, her maiden voyage season cut dramatically short. But the damage was far more extensive than initially apparent. When she was dry docked for inspection, the full extent of the catastrophe became clear. The collision had not only opened up her hull and damaged her propeller, but it had also twisted her keel, the backbone of the ship, potentially compromising her structural integrity for the remainder of her operational life. For the White Star Line, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. The Olympic had cost over $7.5 million to build, an astronomical sum in 1911. Now she faced months of expensive repairs, and even after those repairs, questions would remain about her seaworthiness and insurability. But the problems went deeper than just the cost of repairs. The collision with HMS Hawke had occurred under circumstances that placed the Olympic at fault. Captain Edward Smith, yes, the same Captain Smith who would later command the Titanic on her fatal voyage, had been in charge of the Olympic when the accident occurred. The subsequent Admiralty Court inquiry found the Olympic to blame for the collision, meaning that the White Star Line would receive no insurance compensation for the damage. This left the company facing a nightmare scenario. They had an expensive ship that needed costly repairs, no insurance money to pay for those repairs, and serious questions about whether insurance companies would be willing to fully cover the vessel in the future. The Olympic had gone from being the crown jewel of the White Star Line fleet to a massive financial liability virtually overnight. Meanwhile, in the same Belfast shipyard where the Olympic was undergoing her repairs, work was proceeding on her sister ship, the RMS Titanic. The Titanic was planned to be virtually identical to her older sister, with only minor modifications and improvements. From a distance, even expert ship observers would have difficulty telling the two vessels apart. They shared the same basic dimensions, the same general layout, the same distinctive four-funnel silhouette that had become the signature of the White Star Line's premium vessels. This similarity, according to the switch theory, was not coincidental. It was the key to a plan that would solve the White Star Line's financial crisis, while simultaneously eliminating a massive liability. The theory suggests that sometime in late 1911 or early 1912, a decision was made at the highest levels of the White Star Line's ownership. Rather than spend millions repairing the Olympic and then operating her under a cloud of doubt about her structural integrity and insurability, they would swap the identities of the two ships. The damaged Olympic would be given the identity of the Titanic and sent out on what was ostensibly the new ship's maiden voyage. But this voyage would not be intended to reach New York. Instead, the disguised Olympic would be deliberately sunk, allowing the White Star Line to collect the full insurance value of a new undamaged vessel while simultaneously eliminating the financial burden of the real Titanic's damaged sister. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now disguised as the Olympic, would quietly slip into service, her true identity hidden from the world. To understand why such a plan might have been attractive, we must consider the financial pressures facing the White Star Line in 1912. The company was owned by the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust controlled by American financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan had invested enormous sums in his shipping empire, but the business was facing increasing competition and declining profitability. The White Star Line needed the Titanic to be a success. They needed her to capture public imagination, dominate the headlines, and establish the company's supremacy on the North Atlantic route. But they also needed to resolve the Olympic problem before it bankrupted the entire operation. According to the switch theory, the solution was as elegant as it was terrible. Switch the ships, sink the damaged one while pretending it was the new one, collect the insurance money, and use the real new ship to rebuild the company's reputation and finances. The theory suggests that the work done on both ships during the winter of 1911 and 1912 was not routine maintenance and completion, but rather an elaborate process of swapping their identities. Features that differed between the ships would need to be altered. Documentation would need to be changed or destroyed. Most importantly, the workers involved would need to be either brought into the conspiracy or kept unaware of what they were truly doing. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers, and the shipyard was a maze of activity with multiple vessels under construction and repair simultaneously. In such an environment, it would be possible to make alterations to both ships without arousing suspicion, especially if the changes were explained as routine modifications or improvements. The workers who might notice discrepancies could be told they were simply upgrading the Olympic to match improvements made to the Titanic design, or vice versa. Only a handful of people at the very top of the hierarchy would need to know the true purpose of the work being done. But for such a plan to succeed, it would require more than just physical alterations to the ships. It would require careful planning of the disaster itself, ensuring that the right people were aboard and the right people were not, and that the sinking would occur in circumstances that would prevent too close an examination of the evidence. The switch theory suggests that every detail of the Titanic's maiden voyage was planned not to showcase a magnificent new ship, but to destroy an old damaged one while making it appear to be an accident. The passenger list, the route, the timing, even the crew assignments, all of these, according to the theory, were carefully orchestrated to serve the conspiracy. As we'll see, the The evidence for this incredible claim goes far beyond simple speculation. There are photographs that seem to show differences between the ship that left Belfast and the ship that left Southampton. There are testimony from shipyard workers who noticed unusual modifications being made. There are suspicious cancellations by wealthy passengers who had every reason to want to be aboard the maiden voyage of the most famous ship ever built. Most tellingly, there are the financial motivations of the men who controlled the White Star Line. Men who stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and who stood to gain millions if a carefully planned disaster could eliminate their problems while simultaneously collecting insurance payments. But before we examine that evidence, we need to understand exactly who these men were and just how much money was at stake in 1912. We need to understand the insurance motive that may have driven over 1,500 people to their deaths in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Money. In the end, according to the switch theory, that's what the Titanic disaster was really about. Not the romance of the sea, not the hubris of calling a ship unsinkable, not even the class divisions that the disaster seemed to highlight. It was about money. Enormous amounts of money that stood to be lost or gained depending on the fate of two ships and the decisions of a few powerful men. To understand the financial pressures that may have driven the conspiracy, we need to understand the business empire of one man, John Pierpont Morgan, the American financier who controlled more wealth and power than perhaps any individual in the history of capitalism. J.P. Morgan was not just wealthy, he was a force of nature in the world of early 20th century finance. His banking house, J.P. Morgan and Company, had financed railroads, steel companies, and industrial empires. He had personally intervened to prevent financial panics, earning him the nickname America's Bank. When the federal government needed money, they came to J.P. Morgan. When major corporations needed capital, they came to J.P. Morgan. By 1912, he controlled assets worth billions in today's currency. But Morgan's empire was not limited to American shores. In 1902, he had founded the International Mercantile Marine Company, a shipping trust designed to dominate transatlantic passenger and cargo traffic. The IM acquired control of numerous shipping lines, including the prestigious White Star Line, Morgan's crown jewel in maritime transportation. The White Star Line was the perfect fit for Morgan's vision. Founded in 1845, it had built its reputation on providing luxury service to affluent passengers crossing between Europe and America. The company's ships were known for their elegance, comfort, and safety record. When Morgan acquired control, he saw an opportunity to create the ultimate expression of luxury travel while generating enormous profits. This vision led directly to the commissioning of the Olympic-class ships. Morgan intended these vessels to be more than just transportation. They would be floating advertisements for the supremacy of his shipping empire. The Olympic, Titanic, and the planned third sister ship Britannic would capture the public imagination and establish IMM as the unquestioned leader in North Atlantic travel. The financial investment was staggering. Each ship cost approximately $7.5 million to build, roughly $200 million in today's currency. The Olympic alone represented an investment larger than the annual budget of many small nations. For the three ships combined, Morgan was risking an amount of money that could have funded a small war. But the potential profits were equally enormous. The North Atlantic passenger route was one of the most lucrative transportation businesses in the world. Wealthy Americans travelling to Europe for business or pleasure were willing to pay premium prices for luxury accommodations. European aristocrats and businessmen crossing to America represented another steady stream of high-paying customers. Immigrants seeking new lives in America provided volume traffic that, while individually less profitable, generated substantial revenue in aggregate. Morgan calculated that the Olympic-class ships would not only dominate this market but expand it. By offering unprecedented luxury and reliability, he could charge premium prices while attracting new customers who had never before considered ocean travel. The ships would pay for themselves within a few years, and then generate enormous profits for decades to come. This was the dream. The reality, as we've seen, was somewhat different. When the Olympic collided with HMS Hawke in September 1911, Morgan's carefully calculated investment began to unravel. The ship that was supposed to be generating revenue was instead sitting in dry dock, requiring expensive repairs. Worse, the legal finding that the Olympic was at fault for the collision meant that insurance would not cover the costs of those repairs. But the problems went beyond just the immediate cost of fixing the damage. The Olympic's accident raised serious questions about the ship's design and safety. If one of these supposedly superior vessels could be so easily damaged in a collision with a smaller ship, what did that say about their construction? More importantly for Morgan's business model, what did it say about their insurability? Insurance was critical to the economics of ship operation. No shipping company could afford to operate vessels worth millions of dollars without comprehensive insurance coverage. But insurance companies were in the business of managing risk, and a ship that had already demonstrated vulnerability might be difficult to insure at reasonable rates. The switch theory suggests that by late 1911, Morgan and his associates realised they faced a potential disaster that went far beyond the cost of repairing one ship. If insurance companies began to question the safety and reliability of the Olympic-class design, it could affect the insurability and profitability of the entire fleet. The Titanic, still under construction, might face higher insurance premiums or coverage limitations based on her sister ship's problems. Even worse, if the Olympic's structural damage was more extensive than initially apparent, the ship might prove to be uneconomical to operate even after repairs. A ship with a damaged keel might suffer from ongoing problems with stability, fuel efficiency, or structural integrity. She might require more frequent and expensive maintenance, reducing her profitability and potentially shortening her operational life. In this context, the switch theory proposes the idea of swapping the ship's identities became attractive, not just as a way to collect insurance money, but as a way to solve multiple problems simultaneously. By sinking the damaged Olympic while disguised as the Titanic, the conspiracy would eliminate the problematic vessel while collecting insurance payments based on the value of a new, undamaged ship. The insurance money would not only compensate for the Olympic's construction costs, but would also provide capital to complete the real Titanic and put her into profitable service. Meanwhile, the real Titanic, now operating under the Olympic's identity, would begin generating revenue immediately. Any questions about the Olympic's performance could be explained away as improvements made during her repair period. The beauty of the plan, from a financial standpoint, was that it transformed a major liability into a substantial asset. Instead of losing money on repairs and operating a damaged ship of questionable profitability, the conspiracy would collect full insurance value for a total loss, while simultaneously putting an undamaged vessel into service. But for such a plan to work, the insurance aspects would need to be carefully managed. The Titanic was insured for £650,000, approximately $75 million in today's currency. This was a substantial amount, but it was less than the ship's actual construction cost, partly because insurance values were typically set below replacement cost to discourage fraudulent claims. However, the insurance money would still represent a significant recovery of Morgan's investment. Combined with the revenues that the real Titanic could generate while operating as the Olympic, the financial benefits of the switch could potentially exceed the total cost of both ships. The theory also suggests that the conspiracy would have additional financial benefits beyond the immediate insurance recovery. By eliminating the Olympic's problems, Morgan could proceed with his plans for the third sister ship, Britannic, without the cloud of questions about the class's design and safety. The successful maiden voyage of the Titanic would generate publicity and confidence that would benefit the entire White Star Line fleet. But perhaps most intriguingly, the switch theory proposes that the financial motive may have extended beyond simple insurance fraud. Some versions of the theory suggest that the disaster was timed to coincide with other events that would benefit Morgan's broader financial interests. In 1913, just 1 year after the Titanic disaster, the United States Federal Reserve System was established. This new central banking system fundamentally changed how American finance operated, and J.P. Morgan was one of its strongest supporters. The Federal Reserve centralized control of American monetary policy and created new opportunities for the kind of large-scale financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in. However, Morgan faced opposition to the Federal Reserve from some quarters, including wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. Some of these opponents happened to be aboard the Titanic when she sank. Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to a mining fortune and a vocal critic of centralized banking, went down with the ship. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another Federal Reserve opponent, died along with his wife. John Jacob Astor IV, one of the wealthiest Americans and a skeptic of Morgan's financial schemes, also perished in the disaster. Meanwhile, J.P. Morgan himself, who had booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage, cancelled his trip at the last minute citing illness. Several of Morgan's business associates and political allies also cancelled their bookings while his opponents sailed to their deaths. This aspect of the theory suggests that the Titanic disaster may have served multiple purposes for Morgan. Not only did it solve his immediate problem with the Olympic and provide insurance money, but it also eliminated some of his most powerful opponents in the debate over American financial policy. Whether or not this political dimension was part of the original plan, the financial motive alone would have been sufficient to drive such a conspiracy. Morgan stood to lose millions if the Olympic problem was not resolved, and he stood to gain millions if a carefully orchestrated disaster could eliminate his problems while collecting insurance payments. The amounts of money involved were so large that they could influence the decisions of governments and the fate of thousands of people. In the world of early 20th century finance, where a handful of men controlled wealth comparable to entire national budgets, the lives of 1,500 passengers might have seemed like acceptable collateral damage in service of a larger financial strategy. But money and motive alone do not prove a conspiracy. For the switch theory to be credible, there must be physical evidence that the ships were actually swapped. There must be documentation, photographs, and testimony that support the claim that the vessel that sank was not the Titanic but her damaged sister. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory claim that such evidence exists, hidden in plain sight in photographs, construction records, and the testimony of those who were present when the conspiracy was allegedly carried out. The human eye, they say, can be deceived. Photographs, however, do not lie. They capture reality with mechanical precision, preserving details that witnesses might forget or misremember. For proponents of the switch theory, photographic evidence forms the backbone of their case that the ship which sank on April 15, 1912, was not the Titanic, but her sister ship, the Olympic. To understand this evidence, we must first appreciate just how similar the Olympic and Titanic actually were. Both ships were built from virtually identical blueprints, with the same overall dimensions, the same basic layout, and the same distinctive four-funnel profile. From a distance, even maritime experts would have difficulty distinguishing between them. However, they were not absolutely identical. The Titanic incorporated several design improvements based on experience gained from the Olympic's early service. More importantly, she included modifications specifically requested by passengers and crew who had sailed on the Olympic and identified areas for improvement. These differences, while minor, were distinctive enough that they could be identified by careful observers. And according to switch theory proponents, photographs of the ship that left Southampton on April 10, 1912, show features that match the Olympic rather than the Titanic. The most frequently cited difference involves the porthole arrangements on a deck, the ship's uppermost passenger deck. The original Titanic plans showed 16 portholes along the forward section of this deck. The Olympic, however, had been built with only 15 portholes in the same area. When the Olympic was being repaired after her collision with HMS Hawke, the damaged area included part of this porthole arrangement. Photographs taken of the Olympic during her repair period show workmen modifying the porthole configuration in this section. Switch theory proponents claim that these modifications were made to match the Titanic's 16 porthole design, as part of the process of disguising the Olympic as her sister ship. However, photographs of the ship that departed Southampton on the Titanic's supposed maiden voyage show only 15 portholes in the critical area, matching the Olympic's original configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned design. This discrepancy might seem minor, but it's precisely the kind of detail that would be difficult to alter quickly and completely. Changing porthole arrangements required cutting through the ship's steel hull and then reinforcing and refinishing the area. It was exactly the sort of modification that might be overlooked in a hasty effort to swap the ship's identities. Another frequently cited difference involves the arrangement of the ship's lifeboats. The Olympic and Titanic were built with slightly different davit systems, mechanical devices used to lower lifeboats into the water. The Titanic was designed with a newer, more efficient davit arrangement that allowed for quicker deployment of the boats. Photographs of the ship at Southampton show what appear to be the older style davits consistent with the Olympic's original configuration. Switch theory proponents argue that the newer davits planned for the Titanic were never installed because the ship that sailed was actually the disguised Olympic. This detail takes on additional significance when considered alongside survivor testimony about the difficulty experienced in launching lifeboats during the disaster. Several witnesses reported problems with the davit mechanisms, delays in getting boats into the water, and confusion about the operation of the launching equipment. If the ship was actually the Olympic with her old davit systems, such problems might explain some of the difficulties experienced during the evacuation. More controversial is evidence related to the ship's propeller systems. The Olympic suffered significant damage to her centre propeller shaft during the collision with HMS Hawke. Repairs to this system were complex and expensive, requiring removal and replacement of major components. Some switch theory proponents claim that rather than properly repairing the Olympic's propeller system, the damaged components were simply patched or temporarily fixed. They argue that the ship that sailed from Southampton had a compromised propulsion system that would have affected her handling and manoeuvrability. This claim is supported, they suggest, by testimony from passengers who noted that the ship seemed to vibrate unusually during the voyage, and by reports that the ship was not achieving her expected speed. If the Titanic was actually the Olympic with a damaged propeller system, these performance issues would be explained. Perhaps more significant than these technical details are the human testimonies from those who worked on the ships. Several workers at Harland and Wolff reported unusual activity during the winter months when both ships were in the shipyard together. James Fenton, a painter who worked on both vessels, later claimed that he noticed significant work being done to modify the Olympic during what was supposedly a routine repair period. According to Fenton, workers were making changes that seemed to go far beyond fixing collision damage. They were altering features of the ship that had nothing to do with the areas damaged in the Hawke incident. Fenton specifically mentioned work being done on the Olympic's passenger accommodations, including modifications to cabin layouts and public room configurations. He claimed that these changes seemed designed to make the Olympic more closely resemble the Titanic's interior arrangements. Even more intriguingly, Fenton reported that workers were instructed to swap various brass fittings and fixtures between the two ships. Nameplates, cabin numbers, and other identifying features were removed from both vessels and apparently switched. When Fenton asked supervisors about this work, he was told it was part of standardising equipment between the sister ships. Another shipyard worker, Robert Hichens, reported seeing unusual activity in the area where the ships' names were painted on their hulls. According to Hichens, the name plates and hull markings on both ships were removed and replaced during the repair period. He assumed this was routine maintenance, but later wondered whether something more significant was happening. Perhaps most compelling is testimony from John Halpin, a shipfitter who worked on both vessels. Halpin claimed that he was specifically assigned to work on swapping interior fittings between the Olympic and the ship under construction that was supposedly the Titanic. He was told that this was being done to upgrade the Olympic with improvements developed for her sister ship. However, Halpin noticed that the work seemed to go both ways. Features from the Olympic were also being installed on the other ship. When he questioned this, supervisors told him that they were standardising the designs to make maintenance and operation more efficient. Only years later, after the disaster, did Halpin begin to suspect that the work he'd been assigned might have been part of a larger deception. He realised that the extensive swapping of components between the ships could have been part of a process of switching their identities entirely. These worker testimonies are supported by documentary evidence from the shipyard. Harland and Wolff's work records from the winter of 1911 to 1912 show extensive modifications being made to both ships. While much of this work was clearly related to repairing the Olympic's collision damage, some entries describe tasks that seem unrelated to the repairs. For example, records show work being done on both ships' passenger cabin configurations, dining room layouts, and recreational facilities. This work is described in vague terms that make it difficult to determine exactly what was being done, but the volume of interior modification seems excessive for routine maintenance or repair work. More suspicious are gaps in the documentation. Several weeks' worth of work records are missing from the shipyard files, apparently lost or destroyed. The missing records cover precisely the period when the most extensive work was being done on both ships. Additionally, some surviving records contain unusual notations and corrections that suggest original entries were altered or replaced. Work orders that originally specified tasks for the Olympic appear to have been changed to specify the same work for the Titanic and vice versa. Switch theory proponents also point to photographic evidence from inside the ships. Comparison of interior photographs taken during construction with photographs taken aboard the ship that sailed from Southampton reveals several discrepancies. The most notable differences involve the first-class dining room and the grand staircase. The Olympic's dining room was originally designed with a specific pattern of decorative panels and light fixtures. The Titanic was planned to have an improved version of the same space, with subtle but distinctive differences in the decorative scheme. Photographs taken aboard the ship at Southampton show decorative features that match the Olympic's original design, rather than the improvements planned for the Titanic. Similarly, details of the grand staircase appear to match the Olympic's configuration, rather than the Titanic's planned modifications. These interior discrepancies are particularly significant because they would be difficult to fake or alter after the disaster. Unlike exterior features that might be changed by salvage operations or natural deterioration, interior photographs taken before the voyage provide a permanent record of the ship's actual configuration. However, the most dramatic physical evidence cited by switch theory proponents involves the ship's construction numbers. Every vessel built by Harland and Wolff was assigned a unique yard number that was stamped or engraved on various components throughout the ship. These numbers served as permanent identification that could not be easily altered or forged. The Olympic was assigned yard number 301. The Titanic was assigned yard number 3909. According to the theory, components with the Olympic's number should have been found on the wreck if it was actually the Titanic that sank. When the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985, some of the recovered artifacts did indeed show construction numbers. However, examining these numbers has proven difficult due to the condition of the wreck and the limited access to recovered materials. Some switch theory proponents claim that construction numbers found on wreck components match the Olympic rather than the Titanic, but this claim is disputed by maritime historians and wreck researchers. The numbers are often partially obscured or damaged, making definitive identification difficult. More recently, some researchers have used advanced imaging techniques to examine construction details on the wreck itself. These studies have identified several features that appear to match the Olympic's configuration rather than the Titanic's planned design. For example, the propeller arrangement on the wreck appears to show evidence of the repair work done to the Olympic's damaged propulsion system. The centre propeller, which should have been a 3-blade design on the Titanic, appears to be a 4-blade configuration that matches repairs made to the Olympic. Similarly, hull plates in areas that should have been newly constructed for the Titanic show evidence of previous damage and repair that would be consistent with the Olympic's collision damage. However, these findings are highly technical and disputed by many experts. The condition of the wreck after more than a century on the ocean floor makes definitive identification of small details extremely difficult. Corrosion, collapse, and damage from the sinking itself have obscured many of the features that might provide conclusive evidence. The physical evidence for the switch theory remains controversial and disputed. While proponents point to numerous discrepancies between the ship that sailed and the ship that was supposed to sail, skeptics argue that these differences can be explained by changes made during construction, errors in documentation, or misinterpretation of photographic evidence. What is not disputed is that significant work was done on both ships during the winter of 1911 to 1912, that modifications were made that went beyond simple repair work, and that there are photographic and documentary discrepancies that have never been fully explained. Whether these discrepancies prove a conspiracy or simply reflect the normal complexities of building and modifying massive ships remains a matter of debate. But for switch theory proponents, the physical evidence forms a compelling case that something was not right about the ship that sailed from Southampton on that April morning in 1912. However, physical evidence is only part of the story. To truly understand the scope of the alleged conspiracy, we must examine not just what was done to the ships, but who was aboard them. The passenger list of the Titanic's final voyage contains names that would reshape the world of finance and politics, and according to the theory, this was no coincidence. Sometimes the most revealing evidence is not what happened, but who was present when it happened. In the case of the Titanic disaster, the passenger manifest reads like a who's who of early 20th century power and influence. But according to the switch theory, this prestigious passenger list was not assembled by chance. Instead, it was carefully curated to serve the purposes of a conspiracy that extended far beyond simple insurance fraud. To understand the significance of the Titanic's passengers, we must first understand the broader context of American politics and finance in 1912. The United States was on the verge of fundamental changes in how its financial system operated. The country had experienced several financial panics in recent decades, and there was growing pressure to create a more stable and centralized banking system. J.P. Morgan and his allies favored the creation of a central bank that would be controlled by major financial institutions. This system, which would eventually become the Federal Reserve, would give unprecedented power to a small group of bankers and financiers. They would control the nation's money supply, interest rates, and credit availability. However, this plan faced significant opposition from wealthy Americans who preferred the existing decentralized system. These opponents feared that a central bank controlled by Morgan and his associates would concentrate too much financial power in too few hands. They argued for maintaining a system where multiple independent banks could compete and where no single institution could dominate the nation's finances. The debate over banking reform was not merely academic. Billions of dollars in wealth and decades of political power hung in the balance. If Morgan's vision prevailed, he and his allies would control the financial destiny of the United States. If his opponents succeeded in blocking the plan, Morgan's influence would be significantly diminished. Into this high-stakes political battle sailed the Titanic, carrying some of the most influential participants in the banking debate. And remarkably, almost all of the Federal Reserve's most powerful opponents happened to be aboard, while Morgan and his supporters were conspicuously absent. The most prominent opponent aboard was Benjamin Guggenheim, heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. The Guggenheim family controlled vast mineral resources and had accumulated enormous wealth through copper, silver and gold mining operations around the world. Benjamin was not just wealthy but politically influential, serving on the boards of multiple corporations and maintaining extensive connections in Washington. Guggenheim had been a vocal critic of Morgan's banking proposals. He argued that a centralized system would stifle competition and innovation in American finance. He favored maintaining the existing system of independent banks and opposed giving any single institution the power to control the nation's money supply. On the night of April 14th, as the Titanic began to sink, Benjamin Guggenheim reportedly dressed in his finest evening clothes and told fellow passengers, "We are prepared to go down like gentlemen." His body was never recovered. Also aboard was Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store and another influential voice in American business. Straus had built his retail empire through careful management and conservative financial practices. He distrusted the kind of financial manipulation that Morgan specialized in and opposed the creation of a central bank that would facilitate such practices. Straus was particularly concerned about the impact of centralized banking on smaller businesses. He argued that a Morgan-controlled central bank would favor large corporations at the expense of independent merchants and entrepreneurs. His opposition to the Federal Reserve plan was well known in political circles. When the Titanic began to sink, Isidore and his wife Ida were offered places in a lifeboat. According to witnesses, Ida refused to leave her husband, saying, "We have lived together for 40 years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship tilted toward her final plunge. Neither body was ever found. Perhaps most significant was the presence of John Jacob Astor IV. one of the wealthiest Americans and a man whose financial influence rivaled Morgan's own. Astor had inherited a vast real estate empire and had expanded it into hotels, railroads, and other investments. His personal fortune was estimated at over $87 million, roughly $2 billion in today's currency. Astor was not merely wealthy, but politically sophisticated. He understood the implications of Morgan's banking proposals and opposed them on both economic and political grounds. He argued that giving Morgan's group control over the nation's banking system would create a financial oligarchy that would undermine American democratic institutions. More than any other individual, Astor had the wealth and influence to effectively oppose Morgan's plans. His opposition carried weight in Congress and in the financial community. If anyone could have blocked the creation of the Federal Reserve, it was John Jacob Astor IV. Astor was travelling on the Titanic with his pregnant young wife, Madeline. When the ship began to sink, he helped her into a lifeboat but was refused passage himself under the Women and Children First protocol. His body was recovered days later, reportedly with his gold watch still in his pocket and over $2,000 in cash. His death eliminated one of the most powerful obstacles to Morgan's banking ambitions. These three men, Guggenheim, Strauss and Astor, represented the core of wealthy American opposition to the Federal Reserve Plan. Their combined influence, both financial and political, posed a serious threat to Morgan's vision of centralized banking control. Their deaths removed major obstacles to the passage of Federal Reserve legislation. But the passenger list's significance extends beyond these three prominent figures. Several other Titanic passengers had connections to the banking debate or to Morgan's business interests. Some were allies who might have provided testimony or support that could have been problematic for the conspiracy. Others were neutral parties whose presence might have been seen as providing legitimacy to the voyage. The theory suggests that the passenger list was carefully managed to ensure that the right people were aboard and the wrong people were not. Key figures in the banking debate who opposed Morgan were encouraged or induced to sail, while those who might have interfered with the plan were kept away. This management allegedly extended to the crew assignments as well. Captain Edward Smith, who commanded the ship, was nearing retirement, and may have been chosen partly because his career was ending anyway. If he survived the disaster, he would soon be out of the shipping business and less likely to cause problems. If he didn't survive, his death would be seen as a heroic sacrifice, rather than evidence of conspiracy. Other key crew members were reportedly chosen for their loyalty to the White Star Line or their lack of detailed knowledge about the ship's construction. Engineers and officers who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic were either not assigned to the voyage or were placed in positions where they would be unlikely to survive if something went wrong. Perhaps most tellingly, J.P. Morgan himself had originally booked passage on the Titanic's maiden voyage. As the owner of the shipping line and the man whose vision the voyage was meant to showcase, Morgan's presence would have been expected and appropriate. His cabin had been reserved, his passage confirmed, and his attendance at various social events planned. But at the last minute, Morgan cancelled his trip, citing illness. He claimed to be suffering from a minor ailment that prevented him from travelling, and he remained in France where he had been vacationing. Remarkably, several of Morgan's close business associates also cancelled their bookings at the last minute, citing various personal and business reasons. The pattern of cancellations was so notable that it attracted attention even at the time. Several newspapers commented on the unusual number of prominent businessmen who had changed their travel plans. Some observers wondered whether there might have been advance warning of problems with the ship or the voyage. Morgan's cancellation is particularly suspicious, because he was photographed in apparently good health at a French resort just days after the disaster. He showed no signs of the illness that had supposedly prevented him from travelling, and he resumed his normal activities immediately after learning of the Titanic's fate. Even more suspicious were the cancellations by Morgan's business partners. Henry Clay Frick, the steel magnate and longtime Morgan ally, had booked passage but cancelled, citing his wife's health. George Washington Vanderbilt II, another Morgan associate, also cancelled his booking at the last minute. Milton Hershey, the chocolate manufacturer who had business relationships with Morgan's interests, similarly changed his travel plans. The pattern suggests that Morgan and his inner circle knew something that the general passengers did not. Whether they had advanced knowledge of the planned disaster, or simply knew that the ship was not safe due to the identity switch, they took steps to avoid being aboard when the conspiracy was carried out. Meanwhile, Morgan's opponents in the banking debates sailed to their deaths, apparently unaware of the danger they faced. The convenient elimination of the Federal Reserve's most powerful critics cleared the way for the legislation that Morgan had been promoting. Indeed, the Federal Reserve Act was passed by Congress in December 1913, less than 2 years after the Titanic disaster. The legislation created the central banking system that Morgan had long advocated, giving him and his associates unprecedented control over American finance. The deaths of Astor, Guggenheim and Strauss had removed the most influential voices that might have prevented this outcome. Some versions of the switch theory go even further, suggesting that the passenger list was managed not just to eliminate political opponents, but also to provide witnesses who would support the official story of the disaster. Certain passengers and crew members who survived the sinking provided testimony that reinforced the narrative of an accidental collision with an iceberg. These survivors described the impact, the flooding, and the sinking in ways that supported the insurance claims and deflected suspicion from the possibility of sabotage or deliberate destruction. Their accounts helped establish the official version of events that has persisted for over a century. However, other survivors provided testimony that was less helpful to the official narrative. Some reported hearing explosions before the ship began to sink, suggesting possible sabotage. Others described unusual behaviour by crew members or problems with the ship's equipment that might have indicated advanced planning of the disaster. These problematic testimonies were reportedly suppressed or discredited during the official investigations. Survivors who told inconvenient stories found their credibility questioned, or their testimony excluded from the final reports. The investigation focused on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures rather than examining the possibility of deliberate destruction. The passenger list evidence is compelling but circumstantial. The coincidence of having so many Federal Reserve opponents aboard while Morgan and his allies stayed away is remarkable, but it could be explained by factors other than conspiracy. The timing of the banking legislation might have been influenced by the victims' deaths, but correlation does not necessarily prove causation. However, when combined with the physical evidence and the financial motives, the passenger list adds another layer to the case for the switch theory. The pattern of who was aboard and who wasn't suggests a level of planning and coordination that goes beyond simple insurance fraud. If the theory is correct, the Titanic disaster was not just about swapping damaged ships or collecting insurance money. It was about reshaping the American financial system and eliminating opposition to a plan that would concentrate enormous power in the hands of a few men. But such an ambitious conspiracy would require more than just manipulating passenger lists and switching ships. It would require control over the disaster itself, ensuring that the sinking occurred under circumstances that would support the official story while achieving the conspiracy's goals. As we'll see in the next chapter, proponents of the switch theory believe that every aspect of the sinking was carefully planned and executed. The final act of any great conspiracy must be the most carefully orchestrated. If the switch theory is correct, then the night of April 14th to 15th, 1912 represented not a tragic accident, but the culmination of months of planning designed to create the appearance of disaster while achieving very specific goals. Every detail of how the ship encountered the iceberg, how she sank, and how the rescue efforts unfolded would need to serve the larger purpose of the conspiracy. To understand how the sinking might have been deliberately orchestrated, we must first examine the unusual circumstances that made the disaster possible. The night of April 14th was characterised by conditions that maritime experts describe as extraordinarily rare and dangerous. The sea was unusually calm, so still that there were no waves breaking against icebergs to make them visible from a distance. The night was moonless, creating darkness so complete that lookouts had virtually no natural illumination to aid their watch. Most unusually, the atmosphere was clear and cold, creating temperature inversion conditions that could cause unusual optical effects, making distant objects appear closer or farther than they actually were. These conditions, while natural, were so unusual that many experienced sailors reported they had never encountered anything like them. Captain Smith himself, with 4 decades of experience on the North Atlantic, had never commanded a ship through such treacherous natural circumstances. But according to the switch theory, these conditions were not just unfortunate coincidences. They were anticipated and exploited by conspirators who had carefully planned the ship's route and timing to take advantage of known dangerous conditions. The theory suggests that the ship's course was deliberately set to take her through areas where icebergs were known to be present. Radio warnings about ice had been received throughout the day, but many of these warnings were reportedly not passed to the bridge crew, or were ignored by officers who should have taken precautionary measures. The ship Californian, which belonged to the same parent company as the Titanic, had stopped for the night in the ice field, her captain declaring conditions too dangerous for navigation. Yet the Titanic continued at nearly full speed through the same waters, despite multiple warnings about the presence of ice. Switch theory proponents argue that this dangerous navigation was not the result of overconfidence or poor judgment, but rather deliberate policy designed to ensure that an accident would occur. The ship needed to encounter an iceberg in order to provide a plausible explanation for her sinking, and her officers were instructed to maintain course and speed despite the obvious dangers. The collision itself occurred under circumstances that some witnesses found suspicious. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first spotted the iceberg, reported that the berg appeared suddenly out of the darkness, giving him only seconds to sound the alarm. However, other witnesses reported seeing the iceberg minutes before the collision, suggesting that it should have been visible to trained lookouts much earlier. Some survivors reported that the ship seemed to turn toward the iceberg rather than away from it in the final moments before impact. While this could be explained by the physics of large ship manoeuvring, it raises questions about whether the collision was truly accidental or was deliberately engineered to ensure maximum damage. More suspicious were reports of explosions aboard the ship shortly after the collision. Multiple witnesses, including passengers and crew members, reported hearing loud bangs and feeling vibrations that seemed separate from the impact with the iceberg. These explosions were officially attributed to boilers bursting as cold water flooded the engine rooms, but some witnesses believed they occurred too soon after the collision to be explained by flooding alone. The switch theory suggests that these explosions may have been caused by deliberately placed charges designed to ensure that the ship would sink quickly and completely. If the collision with the iceberg was not sufficient to guarantee the ship's destruction, additional sabotage might have been necessary to achieve the conspiracy's goals. The pattern of flooding also struck some observers as unusual. While the official investigation concluded that the iceberg had opened 5 compartments to the sea, causing fatal flooding, some witnesses reported that water seemed to be entering the ship from multiple locations, not just the area of the supposed iceberg damage. Crew members working in areas far from the collision reported rapid flooding that seemed inconsistent with damage caused by scraping along an iceberg. Some suggested that the ship's hull might have been weakened in advance, either through the supposed identity switch or through deliberate sabotage, making her more vulnerable to catastrophic damage. The behaviour of some crew members during the disaster also raised questions. While many officers and crew performed heroically, trying to save as many passengers as possible, others seemed strangely unprepared for the emergency or reluctant to take action that might have saved more lives. The ship's wireless operators continued sending routine commercial messages even after the collision, delaying distress calls that might have brought rescue ships more quickly. Some officers seemed confused about the severity of the damage or uncertain about proper emergency procedures, suggesting that they might not have been fully briefed on the ship's actual condition or capabilities. Most suspiciously, the ship's lifeboats were launched with far fewer passengers than their capacity allowed. While this was officially attributed to panic and poor training, some witnesses reported that crew members actively prevented passengers from entering boats that had space available. The switch theory suggests that this was not incompetence but deliberate policy designed to ensure that specific passengers would not survive. If the conspiracy's goal was to eliminate certain individuals while allowing others to live, controlling access to lifeboats would be an effective method of determining who lived and who died. The nearby ship Californian adds another layer of suspicion to the night's events. This vessel, owned by the same International Mercantile Marine Company that controlled the White Star Line, had stopped for the night approximately 20 miles from the Titanic's position. Her captain, Stanley Lord, claimed that conditions were too dangerous for navigation and that his ship would remain stationary until dawn. However, the Californian's crew reported seeing rockets and distress signals from the direction of the Titanic throughout the night. Despite these obvious signs of a ship in distress, Captain Lord chose not to investigate or offer assistance. He claimed that he believed the signals were routine communications or celebrations, not emergency distress calls. This explanation seems implausible given that the Californian's crew were experienced sailors who should have recognized distress rockets when they saw them. The switch theory suggests that the Californian was positioned deliberately to provide rescue services for the conspiracy's chosen survivors while maintaining plausible deniability about why she didn't help the others. According to this theory, the Californian was meant to arrive at the scene early enough to rescue specific passengers, but late enough to allow the ship to sink and eliminate the unwanted victims. However, a miscommunication or timing error prevented this plan from working properly, leaving the Californian too far away to effectively participate in the rescue. Instead, the rescue was carried out by the Carpathia, a ship belonging to a different company that responded to the Titanic's distress calls and arrived at the scene several hours after the sinking. The Carpathia's captain and crew were not part of the conspiracy and performed genuine rescue work, saving over 700 survivors. But the delay in rescue efforts, whether planned or accidental, ensured that the ship sank completely and that most of her passengers and crew died in the frigid waters. This served the conspiracy's purposes by eliminating witnesses who might have been able to identify discrepancies between the Olympic and Titanic, while also removing the political opponents whose deaths were part of the larger plan. The sinking itself was remarkably complete and thorough. Unlike many shipwrecks, which settle on the ocean floor largely intact, the Titanic broke apart as she sank, scattering debris over a wide area and making subsequent examination of the wreck extremely difficult. This destruction could have been the result of natural forces acting on a ship not designed to sink at such an angle, but it also served to obscure evidence that might have revealed the ship's true identity. The complete loss of the ship meant that investigators had to rely on survivor testimony and limited physical evidence to reconstruct what had happened. Since many of the most knowledgeable witnesses had died in the disaster, and since the survivors had been through a traumatic experience that might have affected their memories, establishing definitive facts about the sinking proved difficult. This uncertainty served the conspiracy's purposes by preventing too close an examination of the evidence. Questions about the ship's identity, the cause of the sinking, or the behaviour of the crew could be deflected by pointing to the lack of conclusive evidence and the confusion inherent in any major disaster. The official investigations that followed the disaster focused primarily on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures. While these investigations identified important problems with lifeboat capacity, crew training and emergency procedures, they did not seriously examine the possibility that the sinking had been deliberately caused. The British Board of Trade Inquiry and the US Senate investigation both concluded that the disaster was the result of excessive speed in dangerous conditions, combined with design flaws that made the ship vulnerable to the type of damage caused by the iceberg collision. These findings supported the official narrative of an accidental tragedy, while deflecting attention from possible evidence of conspiracy. However, some evidence presented to these investigations was inconsistent with the official conclusions. Witnesses testified about explosions, unusual flooding patterns, and crew behaviour that suggested advanced knowledge of the disaster. This testimony was generally dismissed or explained away, but it remained part of the official record for those who knew where to look for it. The investigations also revealed suspicious gaps in the documentary evidence. Ship logs, construction records, and other documents that might have provided definitive information about the vessel's identity or condition were missing or had been destroyed. While this was officially attributed to the chaos of the disaster, it prevented investigators from definitively establishing key facts about the ship and her voyage. Perhaps most tellingly, the investigations made no serious attempt to examine the financial aspects of the disaster. The insurance arrangements, the ownership structure of the shipping companies, and the business relationships between key figures were not considered relevant to understanding why the ship sank. This focus on technical rather than financial questions served the conspiracy's purposes by avoiding examination of the motives that might have driven such an elaborate deception. The investigations treated the disaster as a tragic accident rather than a possible crime, and their conclusions reinforced the official narrative that has persisted for over a century. But if the switch theory is correct, the sinking of the Titanic was not just a crime, but a nearly perfect crime. The destruction of evidence, the elimination of witnesses, and the misdirection of official investigations created a cover-up so complete that the truth has remained hidden for more than 100 years. As we'll see in the next chapter, maintaining this cover-up required ongoing efforts by powerful interests to suppress evidence, discredit investigators, and control the historical narrative of the disaster. In the aftermath of any major conspiracy, the cover-up often proves more challenging than the original crime. Evidence must be suppressed, witnesses must be silenced or discredited, and investigators must be misdirected away from uncomfortable truths. If the switch theory is correct, the years following the Titanic disaster saw one of the most comprehensive and successful cover-ups in modern history. The cover-up began almost immediately after news of the disaster reached shore. Within hours of the Carpathia's arrival in New York with the Titanic survivors, powerful interests were already working to control the narrative of what had happened and to prevent inconvenient questions from being asked. J.P. Morgan's representatives were among the first to arrive at the dock, not to provide comfort to survivors, but to begin the process of managing information. Survivors were reportedly approached by company officials and lawyers who offered assistance with travel arrangements, medical care and financial support. However, this assistance came with subtle but clear expectations about what survivors should and should not say about their experiences. Some survivors later reported being advised to focus their testimony on the heroism of the crew and the tragedy of insufficient lifeboats, while avoiding speculation about the cause of the disaster or unusual circumstances they might have observed. Those who had noticed discrepancies between the ship they boarded and the ship they expected to board were encouraged to attribute these differences to their own confusion or lack of technical knowledge. More direct pressure was reportedly applied to survivors whose testimony might have been particularly damaging to the official narrative. Crew members who had worked on both the Olympic and Titanic and might have been able to identify which ship actually sank were offered generous severance packages and assistance finding new employment, with the understanding that their maritime careers would be over if they spoke publicly about their experiences. The most dangerous witnesses were those who had observed the supposed identity switch taking place in the Belfast shipyard. These workers faced more serious consequences if they chose to speak out. Some reported being visited by company representatives who made it clear that their employment, their safety, and the welfare of their families depended on their discretion. James Fenton, the painter who had noticed unusual modifications being made to the Olympic, later claimed that he was approached by men who warned him that discussing his observations would be considered a breach of his employment contract and potentially a criminal violation of trade secrets laws. He was told that speaking to journalists or investigators could result in prosecution and imprisonment. Other shipyard workers reported similar intimidation. Some were offered money to relocate to distant cities where they would be less likely to encounter investigators or journalists. Others were simply fired from their jobs and found that their names had been blacklisted throughout the shipbuilding industry, making it impossible for them to find similar work. The most comprehensive aspect of the cover-up involved the systematic destruction or alteration of documentary evidence. Harland and Wolff shipyard records that might have revealed the true extent of work done on both ships were reportedly destroyed in a series of accidental fires and floods that occurred in the months following the disaster. Work orders, progress reports, and material requisitions that could have definitively established which ship was which were among the documents lost in these convenient accidents. The missing records covered precisely the time period when the alleged identity switch would have taken place, eliminating the most direct evidence of the conspiracy. More subtly, surviving documents were reportedly altered to remove inconvenient details or to create confusion about the timeline of work done on both ships. Serial numbers were changed, dates were altered, and work descriptions were modified to obscure the true nature of the modifications that had been made. The British Board of Trade investigation, which was the primary official inquiry into the disaster, showed unusual patterns in how it gathered and evaluated evidence. The investigation focused almost exclusively on technical questions about ship design and safety procedures, while avoiding examination of financial motives or business relationships that might have suggested conspiracy. Key witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony were not called to testify, or their testimony was limited to narrow technical questions that avoided broader issues about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the voyage. The investigation's final report contained numerous conclusions that were not fully supported by the evidence presented, suggesting that the outcomes had been predetermined. Even more suspicious was the speed with which the investigation was concluded and its findings accepted by government authorities. For a disaster of such magnitude and complexity, the investigation was remarkably brief and superficial. Important questions were left unanswered, and significant discrepancies in witness testimony were ignored or explained away without adequate investigation. The US Senate investigation, led by Senator William Alden Smith, initially appeared more thorough and independent. Senator Smith was known for his skepticism of large corporations and his willingness to challenge powerful interests. His investigation called numerous witnesses and examined many aspects of the disaster that the British inquiry had ignored. However, as the investigation proceeded, it became apparent that Senator Smith was facing pressure from influential sources to limit the scope of his inquiry. Key witnesses were suddenly unavailable or changed their testimony between preliminary interviews and formal hearings. Documentary evidence that had been promised to the investigation failed to materialise or was found to be incomplete. Most tellingly, the investigation avoided examining the financial aspects of the disaster. Despite the enormous insurance claims involved and the clear financial benefits that accrued to certain parties, the investigation treated these as irrelevant side issues rather than potential motives for conspiracy. The final report of the Senate investigation contained strong criticisms of White Star Line's safety procedures and British maritime regulations, but it concluded that the disaster was fundamentally accidental. Like the British inquiry, it avoided any suggestion that the sinking might have been deliberately caused, or that there might have been financial motives behind the tragedy. In the years following the official investigations, efforts to independently examine the disaster faced systematic obstruction. Journalists who attempted to investigate discrepancies in the official story found their sources drying up and their access to information restricted. Maritime historians who raised questions about the disaster's circumstances found their work discredited or their employment threatened. Perhaps most remarkably, several independent investigators who had begun to uncover evidence supporting the switch theory died under suspicious circumstances. Some died in apparent accidents, others from sudden illnesses, and still others simply disappeared while pursuing their research. Robert Hitchens, the shipyard worker who had observed unusual activity around the ship's nameplates, died in a fall from scaffolding while working on another project less than a year after the disaster. The accident occurred despite Hitchens' reputation as an experienced and safety-conscious worker who had never before been injured on the job. John Halpern, the ship fitter who had worked on swapping components between the Olympic and Titanic, died of a sudden heart attack despite being relatively young and having no history of heart problems. His death occurred just days before he was scheduled to be interviewed by an American journalist who was investigating discrepancies in the official story. Several other shipyard workers who had knowledge of the construction process died in various accidents or from sudden illnesses in the years immediately following the disaster. While these deaths could be coincidental, the pattern suggests a systematic effort to eliminate witnesses who might have provided inconvenient testimony. The cover-up also extended to controlling the physical evidence from the disaster. When bodies were recovered from the ocean, they were processed through facilities controlled by White Star Line representatives. Personal effects were catalogued and returned to families, but items that might have provided clues about the ship's true identity were reportedly lost or misdirected. More significantly, efforts were made to prevent independent examination of the wreck site. In the early decades after the disaster, technology did not exist to reach the wreck on the ocean floor, but White Star Line and its successors took steps to ensure that when such technology became available, access to the wreck would be controlled. Legal claims were filed asserting ownership rights over the wreck and its contents. These claims were designed to prevent independent researchers from examining the evidence without permission from the companies that had controlled the ships. By controlling access to the wreck, these interests could ensure that any examination would be conducted under their supervision and that inconvenient findings could be suppressed. The most sophisticated aspect of the cover-up involved shaping the cultural memory of the disaster. Rather than simply suppressing evidence, the conspiracy's beneficiaries actively promoted a specific narrative about the Titanic that emphasized heroism, tragedy, and the lessons learned about maritime safety. Books, articles, and eventually films about the disaster focused on human interest stories, rather than technical questions about the ship's identity or the circumstances of the sinking. The narrative of the brave band playing hymns as the ship sank, of the noble sacrifice of men who gave their lives so that women and children could survive, and of the hubris of calling any ship unsinkable, became the dominant cultural memory of the disaster.